Prepare to delve into the world of ancient Greek legends, where heroic tales intertwine with divine intrigues, and the shadows of the past relentlessly pursue mortal destinies. Before us lies a journey, unhurried yet captivating, spanning centuries as we trace the footsteps of one of antiquity's most legendary figures. Uncover secrets hidden behind the veil of time, and allow yourself to be captivated by the rhythm of ancient voices, whispering stories around campfires for millennia. We are about to follow the path of a great hero, from his first, barely perceptible breath to his last, seemingly impossible feat. Immerse yourself in the atmosphere of ancient Thebes on a warm summer night. The air is rich with the intoxicating scents of olive oil and freshly baked bread, and in one humble dwelling an event unfolds that will forever alter the course of mythology. Here, in the embrace of night, a woman named Alcmene prepares to become the mother of a child destined to be the most celebrated hero in all of Greek mythology. Yet, this is merely the prelude to an epic saga that will span 12 impossible tasks. And it all begins with the complex and convoluted love life of Zeus, the almighty king of the gods. Zeus, as is well known, had a rather mixed reputation. While his lawful wife Hera sat majestically beside him on Mount Olympus, Zeus himself was remarkably inconstant. He readily assumed various forms and descended to mortal women, leaving behind numerous offspring, children, half human, half divine. These demigods, destined for extraordinary lives, nonetheless constantly lived under the oppressive shadow of Hera's relentless jealousy. Alcmene, however, differed from Zeus's other mortal lovers in her unwavering virtue. Throughout the city of Thebes, she was renowned for her integrity and steadfast loyalty to her husband, Amphitryon. But Zeus, being Zeus, saw this not as an obstacle, but rather as a challenge worthy of his divine majesty. And so, one night, while Amphitryon was away at war, Zeus assumed the exact likeness of Alcmene's husband and appeared before her. Alcmene, genuinely believing it was her beloved husband returned home early, greeted him with undisguised joy. That single night became a turning point that changed everything. When the real Amphitryon returned the next day, Alcmene was bewildered by his accounts of the previous evening, which did not align with her memories at all. But by then, it was too late. Zeus had had his way, and Alcmene soon discovered she was carrying the child of the king of the gods. Imagine yourself a servant in that household, watching the months pass. You notice that Alcmene's pregnancy seems unusual. The baby kicks with extraordinary strength, and Alcmene experiences strange dreams. Meanwhile, on Mount Olympus, Hera slowly but inexorably learns of her husband's latest infidelity. Hera's wrath was not solely fueled by jealousy, though that certainly played its part. She was the patroness of marriage and family, and Zeus's constant philandering was a personal affront to everything she represented. But this child was destined to be special. Zeus had grand plans for him, and Hera simply could not allow it. The night of the birth arrives, and you feel the tension in the air, like the pressure before an approaching storm. Alcmene goes into labor, but something is wrong. Hours pass, then more hours. The midwives whisper among themselves, their faces etched with worry. The baby should have been born by now, but it seems as if some unseen force is holding back the natural process. What Alcmene doesn't know is that on Mount Olympus, Hera has sent Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, to sit by Alcmaeon's door. Eileithyia sits cross-legged, with her fingers interlocked, using her divine power to prevent the birth. This is an ancient form of magic, and it works perfectly. But in these old stories there is always someone quick-witted. One of Alcmaeon's maids, a sharp woman named Galanthis, notices something strange about the stranger sitting by their door. This woman has been there for hours, never moving, never speaking a word, just sitting in that peculiar posture. Galanthis realizes this might be divine interference. So Galanthis rushes out, joyfully shouting, "The baby is born! The baby is born!" It's a beautiful, healthy boy. Eileithyia, startled by this false news, leaps up and unclasps her limbs in surprise. And in that instant the spell is broken. Alcmaeon's labour immediately resumes its natural course. The child is born with a powerful cry that seems to shake the very walls of the house. The midwives gasp when they see him. He is larger than any newborn they have ever delivered, with a grip so strong he nearly breaks the finger of the woman trying to swaddle him. His eyes, when they open, seem to possess an intelligence far beyond his mere moments of life. Alcmaeon names him Alcaeus, meaning strength of Alcmaeon, but history will know him by another name, Heracles, meaning glory of Hera. It's almost ironic, isn't it? The child who will spend his entire life trying to appease Hera's wrath bears a name that honours her. But Hera is not finished. Not at all. A few nights after the birth, when the household has finally settled into something resembling normal, she makes her next move. 2 enormous snakes slither through the darkness toward the nursery, where the infant Heracles sleeps beside his twin brother, Iphicles. Yes, Alcmaeon had twins, but only one was the child of Zeus. Imagine yourself a guard walking the quiet streets of Thebes that night. The moon is high, casting long shadows between the buildings. You hear nothing unusual, see nothing strange. But inside that house, something extraordinary is happening. The snakes slip through the window, their scales barely rustling against the stone sill. These massive creatures, sent by Hera herself, possess venom strong enough to kill 12 grown men. Their eyes gleam in the moonlight as they approach the sleeping infants. Iphicles wakes first and begins to cry, a natural reaction for any ordinary child encountering such horror. His cries awaken his parents, who rush in, but by the time they reach the nursery, they find something that will be talked about in Thebes for generations. There the infant Heracles is gurgling happily, holding an enormous snake in each tiny fist. He is squeezing them like toys, and these massive serpents, these instruments of divine vengeance, are dead. The child who should have been frightened to death is laughing. The child who should have been helpless has instead demonstrated a strength that should not belong to one barely a week old. Amphitryon looks at the scene, and understanding begins to dawn on him. His wife's mysterious pregnancy, the difficult birth. And now this display of impossible strength. This is no ordinary child. This is the son of a god. From that night on, everyone in the house knew they were raising someone special. Heracles grew with supernatural speed and strength. By the time he was a toddler, he could lift stones that grown men struggled with. At 5, he could outrun horses, but with that strength came a burden that would haunt him his entire life, Hera's unending hatred. You see, this isn't just a story about a strong child. This is the beginning of a much longer narrative about what happens when divine power collides with mortal life. Heracles did not choose to be Zeus's son. He did not ask for supernatural strength or Hera's eternal enmity. But from the moment of his birth, his path was predetermined. As young Heracles grew, his parents tried to give him as normal a childhood as possible. They hired the best teachers, Linus for music, Castor for wrestling, and Chiron the centaur for hunting and healing. But even in these lessons, Heracles' nature shone through. When Linus tried to correct his lyre playing with a sharp word, Heracles accidentally killed him, with the instrument in a fit of irritation. These unfortunate accidents became a pattern. Heracles' strength, combined with his all-too-human emotions, created constant problems. He didn't mean to harm anyone, but when you are 10 times stronger than everyone around you, even the gentlest touch can cause damage. Meanwhile, on Mount Olympus, Hera watched and waited. She understood that direct attacks wouldn't work. The boy was too strong, too resilient, but patience is a divine virtue, and Hera had all the time in the world. She began to sow the seeds of a much more sophisticated revenge, one that would use Heracles' own strength against him. And so our hero grew to manhood, beloved by his family, revered by his city, yet carrying within him the seeds of both greatness and tragedy. His birth was marked by wonders and monsters, and his life would be defined by the tension between his divine heritage and his human heart. But what happens when that human heart is pushed to its limits? What happens when divine manipulation meets a mortal breaking point? The answer to that question lies in the shadows already gathering over Heracles' seemingly bright future. The shadows we spoke of are about to fall upon Heracles' life in the cruelest way imaginable. You will witness how even the mightiest hero can be broken not by external enemies, but by divine manipulation of his own mind. Imagine Heracles now, a grown man in the prime of his life. He is married to Megara, a princess of Thebes, and they have 3 beautiful children. Their home is filled with laughter and the ordinary sounds of family life. Children play, Megara hums as she tends to the garden, Heracles tells stories by the fire in the evenings. You could pass their home any day and see what appears to be perfect domestic bliss. But what lies beneath this idyllic picture? And how long will this fragile happiness last, when the goddess Hera continues to weave her insidious plots? This is just the beginning of a journey full of trials and tragedies that await the greatest of heroes. Heracles, renowned for his extraordinary might, dedicated it to the well-being of his city. He tirelessly fought bandits, protecting travellers from danger, and actively participated in large-scale construction projects that contributed to Thebes' prosperity. His children, with joyful squeals, climbed him like a living mountain as he gently tossed them into the air. However, the goddess Hera watched all this with growing irritation. Before her eyes was Zeus's illegitimate son, who had not only survived but thrived. He was surrounded by love, respected, and had a family. Everything that it seemed should bring him happiness. And this was utterly unacceptable to Hera. Her direct attempts to destroy him had failed. Now she prepared to employ something far more insidious. The truth is, the cruelest punishments often manifest by turning our greatest strength into our worst weaknesses. Heracles' strength had always been his defining characteristic. But what if that power spiraled out of control? What if the very might that made him a hero became the instrument of his greatest tragedy? Hera decides to inflict Lysa, the goddess of mad frenzy, upon Heracles. This was not the ordinary madness that makes a man rave and foam at the mouth. This was something far more subtle and therefore more terrifying. This was the kind of madness that creeps in slowly, distorting perception, twisting reality, until one can no longer distinguish friend from foe. The madness begins to manifest on a seemingly ordinary evening. Heracles returns home after a day spent helping farmers move massive boulders from their fields. He feels tired but satisfied, anticipating dinner with his family. However, as he approaches his dwelling, he senses that something is wrong. Familiar sounds seem different to him. His children's laughter sounds menacing. Megara's voice, calling them to dinner, takes on a conspiratorial tone. One can imagine a neighbour, perhaps tending their garden as evening falls. They notice Heracles standing perfectly still at his front door, head cocked, as if listening to something only he can hear. A tension is visible in his shoulders that wasn't there that morning. His hands, usually so gentle with his family, are clenched into fists. Inside the house, Megara and the children are completely unaware of the impending doom. She prepares dinner. Bread, still warm from the oven, olives from their own tree, cheese from the market. The children are playing a game that involves much running and giggling. It is the very scene that should warm any father's heart. But when Heracles finally enters, he does not see his family. Lysa's influence has so distorted his perception that he sees enemies everywhere. His beloved wife appears to him as a threat that must be eliminated. His precious children present themselves as the offspring of his enemies, sent to destroy him. The tragedy unfolds with horrifying speed. Heracles, believing he is defending himself against attackers, uses his immense strength to fight what he perceives as monsters and enemies. But there are no monsters. There are no enemies. There is only a loving family who trusted him completely and never anticipated an attack. When the madness finally recedes, Heracles finds himself standing in his own home, surrounded by devastation. The reality of what he has done crashes over him like a cold wave. His wife, his children, all dead by his own hand. The strength that was meant to protect them became the instrument of their destruction. Imagine the moment when his vision fully clears. The late evening light streams through the window, illuminating a scene of such heartbreaking grief that even the gods themselves might have wept. Heracles falls to his knees, his great strength useless against the weight of sorrow and horror. He lets out a cry of such agony that people throughout the city of Thebes stop what they are doing, struck by the sound of a soul tearing apart. Neighbours rush in, but stop at the threshold, seeing what has happened. Before them is the great hero of Thebes, the man who could wrestle lions and move mountains, reduced to sobbing over the bodies of his own family. Some whisper that this must be divine punishment. Others simply stand in shocked silence. News quickly spreads through the city. By morning, everyone knows what has happened. But the question that troubles everyone is the same one tormenting Heracles. How could someone so fundamentally good commit something so unspeakably evil? The answer, of course, lies with Hera and her cruel manipulations. But knowing this does not make the grief less real or the guilt easier to bear. Heracles may have been an unwitting instrument of tragedy, but the blood on his hands is still real. the love he lost is still gone forever. For days, Heracles refuses to eat, drink, or speak to anyone. He sits in his ruined home like a statue staring into nothingness. Friends try to approach him, but his sorrow is so profound that words seem inadequate. What can one say to a man whose greatest strength has become his greatest curse? Finally, his nephew, Iolaus, manages to reach him. Iolaus is young, barely more than a boy, but he has always idolized his uncle. He sits beside Heracles and doesn't try to offer comfort or explanations. He just sits there, sharing the silence. After a long time, Heracles finally speaks, his voice barely a whisper. "I killed them. I killed my family. How can I live with this?" Iolaus, wise beyond his years, does not try to downplay what happened or offer easy absolution. Instead, he says something that will change the course of Heracles' life. "Uncle, you cannot bring them back. But perhaps you can make their deaths mean something. Perhaps you can find a way to serve others so fully that their memory becomes a blessing, not a curse." This conversation planted the seed of an idea that would eventually lead Heracles to the Oracle of Delphi. But first, he had to somehow find a way to live with what he had done. He begins to wander, leaving Thebes behind, unable to bear the sight of the home where his family died. For months, he roams the Greek countryside like a ghost. He helps where he can, clearing roads of bandits, saving travelers from wild animals. But he takes no joy in these acts of heroism. They are penance, not celebration. He is trying to balance some cosmic scales, though he knows nothing can truly balance the loss of innocent lives. During this time of wandering, Heracles develops a philosophy that will guide him in what is to come. He learns that strength without wisdom is dangerous, that power without humility is destructive. He begins to understand that true heroism is not about being the strongest or the bravest. It is about serving others, especially when serving others costs you everything. Grief changes him in fundamental ways. The easy confidence of his youth is gone, replaced by a deeper understanding of human fragility. He has learned that anyone, no matter how strong or well-intentioned, can fall victim to forces beyond their control. This knowledge makes him more compassionate toward the failures of others and more determined to use the rest of his life in service to those who need protection. But the question remains, what form should this service take? How does one atone for the unforgivable? The answer will come from the most unexpected source, from the very cousin who always envied his strength and will use that strength to humiliate him in ways that would make even the gods uncomfortable. Sometimes the path to redemption lies through the valley of humiliation, and sometimes that is exactly where a broken hero needs to go to become whole again. The path to atonement led Heracles to Delphi, where the oracle spoke in riddles and smoke. Her words still echoed in his mind as he walked the dusty road to Tiryns. Serve Eurystheus for 12 years, perform all the tasks he gives you. Only then will you be cleansed of your guilt. One might wonder how someone as mighty as Heracles came to be bound to serve his cowardly cousin Eurystheus. This was precisely Hera's design. She had arranged for Eurystheus to be born moments before Heracles, making him the rightful king of Tiryns and giving him the legal authority to command the son of Zeus. It was a masterpiece of divine manipulation, using Heracles' own sense of honor to ensnare him in servitude. Imagine the scene as Heracles first arrives at the palace in Tiryns. Eurystheus has had a bronze chamber built for himself underground, a bunker where he could hide whenever his dangerous cousin visited. The irony is palpable. A king so terrified of his subject that he literally needs to go underground to feel safe. But today, for the first labour, Eurystheus forces himself to appear in person. He sits on his throne, trying to look regal, while his hands tremble slightly. Heracles kneels before him, and one can see the struggle on the hero's face. Every instinct tells him to refuse this humiliation, but his promise to the oracle holds him fast. Your first task, Eurystheus declares, his voice slightly shaking, is to kill the Nemean lion and bring me its hide as proof. Now, one might think this sounds simple enough. Heracles has killed dangerous animals before, but the Nemean lion is no ordinary beast. This creature is a progeny of monsters. Its mother, Echidna, was half woman, half serpent, and its father, Typhon, was a giant with 100 dragon heads. The lion itself is massive, with a golden pelt that gleams like armour and claws that can shred the strongest shields. Most importantly, the Nemean lion's hide cannot be pierced by any mortal weapon. Swords bend against it, spears shatter, arrows bounce off harmlessly. For 3 decades, a monstrous creature had terrorized the surrounding lands of Nemea, ruthlessly destroying herds, travelers, and anyone who dared challenge it. Its sinister presence had led to entire settlements being abandoned, turning into ghostly ruins. Heracles, showing no overt resistance, accepted this commission, though a deep focus was evident in his gaze. The hero was learning the art of contemplation before action, carefully strategizing rather than relying solely on brute force. This newfound insight, born from personal tragedy, promised to be an invaluable asset in the harsh trials to come. The journey to Nemea took him several days. Heracles wisely used this time to gather essential information. He stopped at roadside taverns and remote farms, conversing with anyone who had encountered the lion or found its victims. The information he gathered was deeply unsettling. The monster was not merely powerful, but also possessed a cunning mind. Its hunting was based on subtle strategy, involving meticulously planned ambushes and learning from previous encounters with hunters. One evening, camping by a babbling brook, Heracles met an old shepherd whose entire flock had been annihilated by the merciless predator. "There's something unnatural about it," the old man murmured, thoughtfully stirring the coals of the fire with a stick. Ordinary beasts don't play with their prey, but this one seemed to revel in the act of killing itself, leaving half the sheep untouched, just scattered, as if wanting to demonstrate something. This frank conversation finally confirmed the vague suspicions already forming in Heracles' mind. The Nemean lion was not just a wild animal, it was a true monster, an embodiment of pure, unadulterated, destructive power. To eliminate it meant not just overcoming a physical threat. It required outsmarting its insidious, malevolent mind. When Heracles finally reached the vicinity of Nemea, signs of the lion's presence were everywhere. Tree trunks were scarred with deep claw marks reaching 8 feet above the ground. The few surviving farmsteads were fortified like true military bastions. Even the air itself seemed permeated with a sense of impending threat, as if the very land remembered the terror that had haunted it. Heracles set up his camp in a dense grove of olive trees, from which he had an excellent view in all directions. He spent the first night in focused observation, using his heightened senses to map the lion's domain. Around midnight, a sinister sound reached his ears, a roar that shook the earth and sent every living creature in the vicinity scurrying for silent cover. It was a sound proclaiming absolute dominance, of a predator so unshakably confident in its own power that it saw no need for stealth. With the arrival of the next morning, Heracles commenced his hunt with full seriousness. He relentlessly followed the lion's tracks through rocky valleys and dense thickets, carefully noting the creature's movements. The footprints left behind attested to the beast's colossal size and astonishing grace. Before him was a hunter capable of moving completely silently at will, despite weighing as much as a small horse. For 3 days they circled each other in a deadly dance, studying one another. Heracles only occasionally caught a glimpse of golden fur gliding through the dense undergrowth. The lion in turn displayed no less attention, studying the hero with the same meticulousness with which Heracles observed it. In these unspoken encounters there was a deep intellectual undercurrent that sent shivers down Heracles' spine. This was not merely a predator stalking its prey. This was a monster evaluating the potential threat posed by its adversary. On the 4th day, Heracles decided to test his assumptions about the lion's invulnerability. He took up a position on a high mountain ridge, affording an unobstructed view, and loosed his best arrow, guided by all his unmatched skill and superhuman strength. The arrow struck the lion precisely in the shoulder, but harmlessly bounced off its hide. The beast didn't even flinch. Instead it turned, fixed its gaze directly on Heracles and bared its fangs in an expression that could only be interpreted as a malevolent grin. That night, alone by his campfire, Heracles wrestled with the seemingly insoluble problem. His sword was useless against the hide. His arrows couldn't pierce it, even his mighty club, hewn from sturdy olive wood, and as hard as wrought iron, seemed utterly ineffective against these supernatural defences. How could one defeat a creature that could not be destroyed by conventional means? The answer, based on careful observation and impeccable logic, slowly emerged in his mind. If the impenetrable hide could not be pierced from the outside, what if the attack came from within? If conventional weapons were useless, what if he used the only thing always with him? His own mighty hands. The plan he devised was incredibly dangerous. He would have to get within arm's reach of the lion to engage it in unarmed combat, close enough for those terrifying claws and deadly fangs to reach his body. Yet this was the only possible path to victory. He would have to strangle the beast, turning its own immense strength against itself. The decisive battle took place in a narrow valley with steep sides, turning it into a natural arena where neither combatant could retreat. At dawn, Heracles entered the valley, making no attempt to conceal his presence. He wanted the lion to be aware of his approach. He sought an honest fight. Predator against predator. The Nemean lion emerged majestically from its lair, like a stream of liquid gold that had taken the form of death itself. It was even more colossal than Heracles had anticipated, with a mane that seemed to radiate its own inner light. For a brief moment, they simply stood, gazing at each other. The monster that had terrorized the entire region for decades, and the hero who had come to end its undisputed reign. Then the lion charged, moving with astonishing speed, incredible for such a massive creature. Heracles made no attempt to dodge or use any weapon. Instead, he met the attack head-on, wrapping his mighty arms around the beast's neck at the very instant its sharp claws dug into the hero's chest. The pain was instantaneous and unbearable. Yet Heracles held on, demonstrating an unyielding will. The struggle that followed was less a battle and more a contest of pure, unwavering will and boundless endurance. The lion thrashed furiously and let out deafening roars, trying to shake off this incredible prey that absolutely refused to die. Its sharp claws tore at Heracles' back and sides. The creature's immense weight threatened to crush him, but Heracles maintained his death grip, slowly but inexorably tightening his arms around the monster's throat. Minutes dragged on. The lion's resistance grew more desperate, then gradually faded. Heracles felt his own strength waning from significant blood loss and extreme exhaustion, but he did not loosen his grip for an instant. This was the lesson he had learned from his tragedy. Sometimes victory requires a willingness to sacrifice everything, including even the certainty of one's own survival. Finally, the mighty beast shuddered one last time and went limp. The terror of Nemea was dead, killed not by sword or spear, but by the sheer, terrifying power of human determination. Heracles loosened his grip and collapsed backward, breathing heavily and bleeding but still alive. However, the task was not yet fully complete. Eurystheus demanded the lion's hide as irrefutable proof. And removing that hide proved almost as impossible a task as killing the beast itself. One must remember that nothing could pierce that golden fur even after its owner's death. Heracles tried every blade in his arsenal, but all proved useless, unable to leave even the slightest scratch. Then a sudden inspiration struck him. If nothing from the outside could cut through the hide, what if he used the lion's own claws? Using one of the fallen creature's razor-sharp claws, Heracles meticulously stripped the hide from the beast. It was slow, excruciatingly patient work, but eventually he had the entire pelt, a gleaming golden hide that would become his distinctive attire. When Heracles returned to Tiryns, clad in the lion's hide like a cloak, the effect on Eurystheus was immediate and profound. The king took one look at his cousin, bloodied, wrapped in the skin of the invincible monster, carrying its massive head like a helmet, and fled in panic to his underground chamber. From that day on, Eurystheus preferred to communicate with Heracles solely through his heralds. He was too consumed by fear to face the hero directly. And perhaps there was wisdom in the king's decision, for something had irrevocably changed in Heracles during his first great labour. He had learned that even the seemingly impossible could be overcome with the right combination of fearlessness, sharp wit, and a pure, unyielding refusal to give up. However, standing in the empty throne room, listening to Eurystheus's muffled voice from the bronze chamber deep underground, Heracles knew clearly that this was only the very beginning of his journey. 11 more labours awaited him, and with each new success, Hera's influence seemed only to grow stronger. The questions that would haunt him throughout all the coming trials were already beginning to form in his mind. What would happen when courage alone was not enough? What trial could break even one who had strangled an invincible lion? The golden lion's hide gleamed brightly in the morning sun as Heracles made his way toward Eurystheus's bronze chamber. News of his first triumphant victory had already spread throughout Hellas, and people lined the roads, eager for even a glimpse of the hero who had accomplished the unthinkable. Heracles, however, paid little attention to their admiration. His thoughts were already entirely consumed by the next trial he was to face. From the secure confines of his underground bunker, Eurystheus's voice echoed through the speaking tube. This ingenious device allowed him to issue his commands while avoiding direct confrontation with the terrifying sight of his successfully completed cousin. "Your second labour," the king announced, his words distorted by the bronze walls, "is to destroy the Lernaean Hydra. And this time you will set forth completely alone." This last, seemingly minor detail was of immense significance. Having witnessed Heracles' victory over the Nemean lion, the goddess Hera had whispered insidious suggestions to Eurystheus. No helpers, no companions, the hero was to face this monster in complete isolation, relying solely on his own might and ingenuity. However, Heracles had already learned something from his loyal nephew Iolaus about the true nature of heroism and devotion. As the hero prepared to depart Tiryns, he found the young man awaiting him by the chariot, fully armed and ready to go. Tiryns. Royal decrees, as is known, are sometimes interpreted in a highly peculiar manner.
"The king ordered you to fight the Hydra alone," Iolaus says with a slight smile, addressing the renowned Heracles, "but he said nothing about you, not having a charioteer for the journey."
Thus begins their journey to the Lernaean swamps. Before us stands the mighty hero in his famous lion's hide, and beside him a spirited youth who utterly refuses to be left out of dangerous adventures. The bond between these two men had deepened and strengthened since that terrible night when Iolaus first managed to break through the despair that had gripped Heracles. Now their relationship is imbued with an easy camaraderie, that true friendship that needs no constant verbal confirmation of its unbreakable nature. As they approach the infamous swamps of Lerna, the surrounding landscape undergoes a grim transformation. The air becomes unusually thick and humid, carrying a distinct, putrid smell of stagnant water and decay. The trees, once stately, now appear twisted and sickly, as if afflicted by an unknown blight. Even the sunlight here seems muted and dim, as if filtered by the perpetual gloom that constantly rises from the marshy terrain. The locals the travellers encounter tell stories capable of unsettling even a hero as fearless as Heracles. The Hydra, they say, is not merely a monster. It is a true plague that has afflicted these lands. Its breath is so poisonous that it can kill vegetation for miles around. Its very presence contaminates the water and soil, and most horrifyingly, the creature possesses 9 heads, each capable of thinking independently, making it even more unpredictable and deadly. "My grandfather saw it once," an old farmer recounts with trembling hands. "He said it was like a nightmare come to life. The Hydra's heads would argue with each other about which way to chase prey. But when they agreed, God help whatever they were hunting. As Heracles and Iolaus draw closer to the monster's lair, the signs of its noxious influence become so obvious they cannot be ignored. Dead fish float belly up in streams that should normally teem with life. Birds fall from the sky, flying too close to the tainted swamp. Even the insects seem unnatural, too large, overly aggressive, altered by the monster's venom. Heracles and Iolaus set up their camp on a hill overlooking the swamps, as close as they dare without risking exposure to the creature's toxic breath. From this vantage point, they clearly see the Hydra's lair, a massive spring from which dark water gushes from deep underground caves. The spring is surrounded by the bleached bones of countless victims, including both animal remains and human skeletons. That evening, as they devise their plan of approach, Heracles shares his observations with Iolaus. "We need to worry about more than just the poison," he says, intently studying the lair in the gathering twilight. "Look at how those bones are scattered. The Hydra doesn't just kill. It plays with its food. Indeed, the arrangement of the bones clearly indicates a creature with a cruel intelligence. Some skeletons lie as if their owners tried to crawl away as death overtook them. Others are neatly stacked in even piles like trophies. This is not a random slaughter by a mindless beast. This is the deliberate work of something that takes perverse pleasure in inflicting terror and suffering. The next morning brings them their first direct encounter with the monster. Heracles approaches the spring alone, as he promised the king. While Iolaus remains at a safe distance with the chariot and horses, the plan seems simple. Lure the Hydra out, engage it in battle, and hope the lion's hide provides sufficient protection from its deadly venom. However, they had overlooked one thing: the Hydra's patience. For hours, Heracles stands at the edge of the swamp, issuing challenges, throwing stones, even firing flaming arrows into the water. But nothing happens. The spring remains still and dark, showing no signs of anything living within its depths. And only when Heracles, frustrated by the apparent lack of response, turns to leave, does the Hydra make its move. The water explodes as something massive rises from the spring. First one head appears, then another, until 9 serpentine necks writhe above the surface, like a forest of malevolent, living trees. The creature's body, when it fully emerges from the water, proves even more terrifying than all the tales suggested. It is the size of an elephant, covered in dark scales glistening with moisture. Each head is unique. Some have horns, others fringed necks. Several have multiple rows of fangs, but all share the same burning red eyes and the same expression of intelligent, deadly hatred. The attack begins from all sides simultaneously. 9 heads strike independently, each trying to corner Heracles while the others provide support. It is like battling 9 different snakes at once, each learning from the successes and failures of its brethren. Heracles' first instinct is to use his mighty club, and initially this seems to work. A powerful blow crushes one of the smaller heads, sending the creature recoiling with a wail of pain that echoes from its remaining 8 mouths. But Heracles watches in horror as something impossible occurs. Where one head was destroyed, 2 new ones begin to grow in its place. This is the Hydra's most terrifying ability, one that no force can overcome by direct assault. Every severed head regenerates as 2, making the creature stronger, not weaker. With growing despair, Heracles realizes that his usual approach, overwhelming force applied with determination, will only make his enemy more powerful. The battle devolves into a nightmare of dodging and maneuvering, as more and more heads sprout from previous wounds. What started as 9 adversaries becomes 11, then 13, then 15. The Hydra's poisonous breath grows more concentrated as its numbers increase, forcing Heracles to fight while holding his breath and keeping his eyes half closed against the toxic fumes. Iolaus, however, observes the battle from his seemingly safe distance. The young man understands that conventional tactics will not work here. This is a puzzle disguised as a battle, and it must be solved, not merely fought. He recalls stories of regenerating monsters from his childhood, tales that always included fire as the key to ultimate victory. Acting on inspiration and desperate bravery, Iolaus drives the chariot directly into the thick of the battle. He leaps out with a flaming torch, reaching the Hydra just as Heracles lops off another head. Before the wound can heal, Iolaus presses the torch to the neck stump, cauterizing it with searing flame. The effect is instantaneous and decisive. The seared wound does not regenerate. Instead, it seals permanently, leaving the Hydra with one less head and no ability to replace it. Heracles immediately grasps this and flashes his nephew a smile of pure admiration. What follows is a dance of perfect coordination between hero and helper. Heracles strikes with surgical precision, lopping off heads one by one, while Iolaus follows with his torch, sealing each wound before regeneration can begin. This requires split-second timing and absolute trust. A moment's hesitation, and the Hydra's head count would spiral out of control. The monster realizes what is happening and grows increasingly desperate. Its remaining heads strike with renewed fury, trying to kill both heroes before they can continue their systematic dismantling. Poison sprays in all directions. The creature's massive body thrashes, trying to crush them with its weight. But Heracles and Iolaus have found their rhythm. Head after head falls to the club and is sealed by fire. 9 become 8, then 7, then 6. With each success, the Hydra's coordination suffers. The remaining heads begin to panic, striking wildly rather than working together. When only one head remains, the Hydra makes a last, desperate attempt to escape. It begins to retreat toward the spring, hoping to reach the safety of the deep water where the heroes cannot follow. But Heracles will not allow it to escape. He leaps onto the creature's back, riding it like a wild horse as he aims his club for the final blow. The last head falls with a wet thud, and Iolaus's torch puts a permanent end to the Hydra's reign of terror. The enormous body shudders once, then goes still. The poisonous mist that has hung over the swamp for decades begins to dissipate, and for the first time in living memory, clean sunlight touches the waters of Lerna. But the work is not yet finished. Heracles has learned to be thorough in his labours. He dips his arrows into the Hydra's blood, creating weapons that will forever carry the monster's venom. These arrows will serve him well in future trials, though they will also bring unexpected tragedy to one he cares deeply for. He also takes the Hydra's central fang, a curved blade, harder than steel and sharp enough to cut through anything, even as he would later discover the Nemean lion's hide. These trophies are not merely proof of victory. They are tools that will prove indispensable in the trials to come. However, when they return to Tiryns, a cruel surprise awaits them from Eurystheus. This labour does not count, he declares from his bronze chamber. You had a helper. Iolaus assisted you with the torch. The task was to face the Hydra alone. This is a bitter moment for Heracles, compounded by the knowledge that Eurystheus is technically correct. But Iolaus steps forward and speaks with quiet dignity. Uncle, we learned something important here. Some monsters cannot be defeated by strength alone. They require friendship, cooperation, and a willingness to trust others. If that invalidates this victory, then perhaps the true victory is not in satisfying kings. It is in discovering what truly makes us strong. Perhaps this was the true lesson taught by the Hydra. Some of life's difficulties are not merely compounded, but multiplied when one charges at them head-on, attempting to overcome them with a direct assault. However, when people work together, skillfully combining their individual strengths and compensating for mutual weaknesses, even the most insurmountable monsters can be overcome. Now, as Heracles prepared for his next trial, one key question hung in the air. Would he remember this valuable truth when the coming labours demanded not just brute force, but also deep insight, immense patience, and the courage to show gentleness? The relationship between Heracles and Eurystheus had undergone a noticeable change. After the bitter dispute regarding the Hydra, a new, more cunning strategy emerged in the tasks the king set for the hero. Eurystheus realized that brute force alone would not be enough to break his mighty cousin's spirit. Something far more subtle, more sophisticated and insidious might be required. Your third labour, Eurystheus announces through his brass speaking tube, a hint of unconcealed malice and deep satisfaction in his voice, is to capture the Ceryneian hind alive and deliver it to me, whole and unharmed. You have exactly 12 months to complete this task. At first, this news might have seemed a relief after the exhausting battles with venom-spewing monsters and creatures with regenerating heads. A hind. What could be so difficult about catching an ordinary beast? However, as Heracles listened carefully to the exhaustive description of his target, he began to perceive the insidious cruelty of this assignment. The Ceryneian hind is not just a wild deer. It is a creature of indescribable beauty with golden antlers, sparkling like captured sunlight, and bronze hooves that emit a melodic ringing sound, like the chiming of bells, as it races. Crucially, it is sacred to Artemis herself, the great goddess of the hunt. Furthermore, it was purposefully placed under powerful divine protection. Any harm to it would inevitably incur the wrath of Artemis. But here is the truly devilish part of this trial. The hind is swifter than any creature ever seen by mortals. It can outrun even the wind, covering hundreds of miles in a single day, knowing no fatigue. For an entire year, Heracles must pursue this elusive creature without causing it the slightest harm, fully aware that his failure will result not only in bitter personal defeat, but also in severe divine retribution. One can imagine Heracles as he prepares for this labour, so strikingly different from the bloody battles he had waged before. Instead of weapons and heavy armour, he packs light hunting nets, sturdy ropes, and provisions for an extremely long and arduous journey. The loyal Iolaus offers to accompany him, but Heracles shakes his head. "This is a task I must undertake alone," he says, "not at Eurystheus's whim, but because I need to learn something important about myself." The pursuit begins in the hills surrounding Cerynea, where the hind is most frequently sighted. Local shepherds whisper about it, describing golden flashes gliding through the forest faster than thought itself. It's like a piece of the sun that broke off and learned to run, an old woman tells Heracles, unnaturally beautiful, but utterly elusive. For the first few months, Heracles pursues the hind, employing his usual hunting methods. He meticulously tracks its hoofprints, which are quite easy to follow as its bronze hooves leave very distinct marks on the soft earth. The hero studies its favoured trails, its watering holes near springs and the meadows where it typically grazes, but each time he gets close enough to see it, it vanishes like a golden dream, dissolving into the air. The hind seems aware of his presence and pursuit, but it does not flee in panic like an ordinary animal. Instead, there is an almost playful quality to their chase. It might graze serenely in a meadow until Heracles approaches close enough to attempt to capture it, then gracefully slip away with movements that seem carefully choreographed. At times, it even pauses to look back at him, as if checking if he has fallen behind. Summer imperceptibly gives way to autumn, and then to winter. Heracles masters the art of reading the seasons through the hind's behaviour. In summer, it prefers high mountain meadows. In autumn, it moves to oak groves where fallen acorns provide easy and abundant sustenance. Winter cold finds it in lower valleys, where streams continue to flow warm thanks to underground springs. But no matter how carefully Heracles studies its habits, he cannot bridge that last critical gap. The hind always remains one step ahead, one elusive leap out of reach. For a man accustomed to solving all problems solely through strength and unwavering determination, this constant yet never achieved completion becomes a kind of gentle yet debilitating torment. It is during the long winter nights, in complete solitude under stars that seemed incredibly distant and cold, that Heracles begins to perceive the true essence of the lesson this labour is teaching him. He learns true patience, not the usual grim-faced endurance he had always relied on, but a deeper, calmer acceptance of events that cannot be rushed. The hero begins to pay close attention to the smallest details he had never noticed before, how the morning mist slowly rises from the streams, the unique quality of light filtering through different tree canopies, and the songs of birds transforming with each change of season. For the first time since the tragic death of his family, Heracles begins to find a semblance of peace in simply being present, without the constant urge to do or achieve anything. Spring arrives, and with it a subtle but significant shift occurs in the dynamic between the hunter and his prey. The hind still evades capture, but now there are moments when it does not immediately bolt at Heracles' approach. It might graze serenely while he sits perfectly still, about 50 yards away, making no attempt to approach or retreat. These moments of peaceful coexistence become more frequent as the months pass. One late spring morning, as Heracles sits by a crystal-clear stream, eating a simple breakfast of bread and olives, the hind appears on the opposite bank. It approaches close enough for him to discern the individual golden hairs of its coat and notice the warm, almost intelligent gaze in its dark eyes. For a long moment, they simply look at each other through the transparent flow of the water. Then something truly astonishing happens. The hind cautiously steps into the stream and begins to slowly cross it, heading toward him. Every hunting instinct screams at Heracles to grab a net, to make a decisive move, but by some inner sense he understands that this would instantly ruin everything. Instead, he continues to calmly eat his breakfast, pretending as if nothing unusual is happening. The hind emerges from the stream and, slowly and cautiously, yet completely without fear, approaches Heracles. It comes so close that Heracles could easily reach out and touch its golden gleaming flank. Instead, he breaks off a piece of his humble bread and offers it to the hind in his open palm. It cautiously sniffs the offering, then accepts it with astonishing gentleness and delicacy. Its soft lips feel like the touch of the finest silk on his skin. For several precious minutes, they share the morning meal in complete comfortable silence. The hero and the sacred hind, predator and prey, find an unexpected and deep friendship in this months-long pursuit that has defined their lives for almost an entire year. It is at this moment of perfect peace and deep harmony that Heracles suddenly realizes the true nature of his task. He was not meant to capture this hind by brute force or cunning trap. He was destined to earn its trust so completely that it would of its own accord choose to follow him. The labour was not an act of conquest, but the establishment of a profound relationship. In the days that followed, this astonishing scenario repeated itself again and again. The hind visits him during his stops, accepts food from his hands, and even allows him to gently stroke its neck. Yet it always maintains its inherent freedom, never coming so close that he could restrain it against its will. Finally, with only 1 week remaining of his year-long term, Heracles makes a decision that surprises even himself with its boldness and unconventionality. He approaches the hind not with ropes or nets in hand, but with simple words. "Lady," he says formally, thereby acknowledging its sacred divine nature, "I require your assistance." Not as a hunter seeking to capture prey, but as one who sincerely asks a favour of a friend. He honestly and openly explains his complex situation to her, the burden of the imposed labours, the deep guilt over the death of his family, and the urgent need for atonement. The hind listens to him with seemingly sincere and deep attention, its head tilted in an almost human gesture of contemplation and sympathy. When he finishes his speech, the hind slowly approaches him and, to his profound astonishment, gracefully lies down at his feet. It offers itself voluntarily, completely trusting him and his promise that it will suffer no harm. It was a moment of such pure, unblemished grace that Heracles finds unbidden tears in his eyes. The journey back to Tiryns becomes for Heracles utterly unlike anything he had ever experienced before. The hind walks beside him like a loyal companion. Sometimes it runs ahead to scout the path. Sometimes it lags behind to explore interesting scents. It could escape at any moment, but each time chooses to stay close. And it is this voluntary choice that transforms the entire nature of the performed labour. When they finally reach the palace, Eurystheus, for the first time since Heracles began his labours, emerges from his gloomy underground chamber. The sight of the golden hind walking freely side by side with the hero is so unexpected and striking that even the cowardly King Eurystheus is drawn out by his insatiable curiosity. "How did you manage to catch her?" Eurystheus asks, clearly expecting to hear a story of cunning traps or overwhelming force. "I did not catch her," Heracles replies simply and calmly. "I asked her to come with me, and she graciously agreed." Sometimes the impossible becomes quite possible when we stop trying to force things and start trying to understand them. As if to emphasize these words, the hind steps forward and gently touches Eurystheus's hand with its nose, a gesture of greeting and friendliness, not submissive obedience. The king, despite all his numerous flaws and vices, recognizes that he is in the presence of something deeply sacred and miraculous. But the labour must be completed in full accordance with its originally agreed upon terms, and these terms require the hind to be delivered into Eurystheus's full control. This was a moment that tested everything Heracles had come to learn and understand about trust and gentleness. The resolution to this unusual situation came from the hind itself. As if comprehending the depth of the dilemma, It allowed Heracles to place a shining golden collar around its neck, not as a means of coercion or a symbol of enslavement, but as a tangible confirmation of their mutual agreement. After this, it calmly and serenely proceeded into the royal stables, where it comfortably settled into a stall, carefully filled with fragrant fresh hay and clean cool water. There it remained for exactly 3 days, a period sufficient for the impeccable fulfillment of all the technical requirements prescribed by the labour. Then, at dawn on the 4th day, it simply vanished, dissolving into thin air. The stall was empty, the collar gone without a trace, leaving behind no evidence save for a single golden hair that Heracles found on his pillow, a poignant token of their special friendship meant to forever remind him of the invaluable lessons learned during the years spent alongside her. Standing in the empty stall, Heracles pondered deeply the unprecedented discoveries that this strangest of all his labours had granted him. He realized that some triumphs are achieved solely through patience, that certain relationships are built on trust, not rigid control, and that sometimes the most effective thing one can do is simply wait for someone to choose to be there. However, even as he savoured these new insights, he was tormented by the question of the next trial. If Eurystheus continued to grow more ingenious in his cruelty, what impossible task would challenge not only Heracles' physical might, but the very foundations of the person he was slowly becoming? Winter had draped Greece in a thick, cold blanket, and the peaceful memory of the Golden Hind felt like an echo from a warmer, gentler time. As Heracles approached Eurystheus' palace, his breath plumed in the frigid air, and snow crunched underfoot with each step. This time, when King Eurystheus' voice echoed from his bronze chamber, it carried a previously unheard note of disappointment. The matter with the hind had not gone at all according to his plan. Eurystheus had hoped to witness Heracles' desperate struggle with an impossible task, not his unexpected bonding with his quarry. Now he was determined to present a challenge that would play on what he considered his cousin's greatest weakness, his innate propensity for violence. "Your 4th labour," Eurystheus declared, "is to capture the Erymanthian boar alive and bring it to me. This monstrous creature terrorizes the slopes of Mount Erymanthus, ruthlessly killing anyone who dares to trespass on its territory. You must bring it back alive, unharmed, and completely under your control." Now, one might think this commission resembled the story of the hind, another mission of capture, not destruction. However, there was a key fundamental difference. The Ceryneian hind was an embodiment of grace and intelligence, capable of voluntarily choosing cooperation. The Erymanthian boar, on the other hand, was pure, unadulterated fury given material form. It was a monster so consumed by its ferocity that it attacked absolutely everything that moved, including even its own reflection in calm water. Try to imagine this creature, if you can. A wild boar the size of a small building, with tusks curved like deadly scimitars, and eyes blazing with the unquenchable fire of perpetual rage. Its hide was thick as armour, and scarred from countless battles with hunters who naively believed that they could claim it as a trophy. Most disturbing of all was that it seemed to take genuine, perverse pleasure in destruction, deliberately trampling crops and destroying everything fashioned by human hands. However, Heracles had learned important lessons from his recent labours. Brute force alone is not always enough for victory, and sometimes the most obvious direct approach proves the least effective. As he prepared for the journey to Mount Erymanthus, he gathered not only his usual weapons, but also ropes, nets, and various implements designed for capture, not for killing. The path led him through some of the most picturesque winter landscapes in all of Greece. Snow-covered mountains rose majestically, like sleeping giants, against a sky so piercingly blue it seemed painted. Pine trees wore fluffy white caps, and streams flowed swiftly, dark and fast between banks of pristine snow. This place would have been ideal for contemplation and tranquility, were it not for the increasingly obvious, ominous signs of the boar's presence. As Heracles ascended higher into the mountains, the evidence of the monster's furious rampage became utterly undeniable. Entire groves of trees had been toppled, their mighty trunks snapped like brittle twigs. Boulders the size of houses had been shifted from their ancient resting places. Even the very landscape seemed to bear the scars and wounds of the boar's destructive power. But the true horror of the creature only became fully clear when Heracles stumbled upon his first human victims. A hunting camp, abandoned in obvious haste, silently told a story of terror and despair. Equipment was scattered as if dropped in flight. The campfire had burned down to cold ash, and tracks in the snow undeniably pointed to where someone had fled in panic, towards the lower valleys. Heracles followed these tracks and eventually discovered a hunter, a middle-aged man named Pholus, who had taken refuge in a cave with several other survivors. They greeted Heracles with the desperate gratitude of people who had lived in constant fear for weeks. "It's not just an animal," Pholus explained as they sat by a small fire that night. "Animals kill for food, territory, or self-defense. This creature kills for the sheer joy of killing. I've seen it chase deer for miles, not to eat them, but just to experience the thrill of the chase. And when it catches them..." He shuddered, unable to finish the sentence. From these survivors, Heracles gained important insights into the boar's behavior. The monster was most active during storms, as if the chaos of wind and snow fueled its rage. It had no permanent lair. It preferred to roam continuously over the mountain slopes. Most importantly, it seemed to grow larger and more aggressive with each passing month, as if its own fury stimulated its growth. Armed with this valuable information, Heracles began his hunt, patiently awaiting the appropriate weather conditions. When a fierce blizzard swept over the mountain, he took up a position in a narrow valley that the boar frequently used as a travel route. His plan was based on careful observation and patience, not direct confrontation, skills he had only recently begun to develop. The boar appeared through the swirling snow, like a dark nightmare woven from vortices and shadows. Its massive figure was barely discernible until it approached close enough to attack. But instead of meeting it head-on, Heracles did something completely unexpected. He retreated, but not in fear, rather strategically, skillfully guiding the creature toward a trap he had been preparing for several days. You see, Heracles had noticed that the boar's rage made it predictable. When it saw potential prey, it attacked immediately and directly, never considering that this might be precisely what its adversary desired. By feigning flight, Heracles awakened the creature's instinct to pursue, while fully controlling the direction of that chase. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Higher up the mountain, Heracles had discovered a natural hollow filled with deep snow. so deep that even the enormous boar would sink into it and become trapped. The challenge was to reach this hollow while staying ahead of a creature that, despite its size, could run faster than a horse. The chase through the blizzard became an epic test of endurance and navigation. Heracles leaped from rock to rock, slid down snow-covered slopes using every advantage the terrain offered. Behind him, the boar tore through the forest like a living avalanche, its fury growing with each passing minute as its prey remained out of reach. But Heracles had calculated the distance with perfect precision. Just as his own strength began to wane, he reached the edge of the snowy hollow. Without the slightest hesitation, he leaped across the gaping chasm to solid ground on the far side. The boar, driven by pure, uncontrollable rage and unable to halt its charge, plunged directly into the deep snow. What followed was almost comical. The majestic monster that had terrorized an entire region found itself stuck, like an enormous, furious piglet. Its rage only exacerbated the situation. Every thrash and attempt to escape drove it deeper into the soft snow. Within minutes, only its head and the tips of its tusks remained visible on the surface. However, now came the truly difficult part, extracting the creature from the snow and delivering it back to Tiryns, all while avoiding being killed. The trapped boar remained lethally dangerous, and now it was maddened with fury at being outsmarted by a mere human. Heracles solved this problem by employing a combination of engineering ingenuity and psychology, carefully working around the creature's limited range of motion. He constructed a wooden cage directly around the boar while it was still stuck in the snow. This was painstaking work. Each plank had to be positioned with surgical precision to avoid the crushing tusks, but eventually he created a mobile prison strong enough to contain even this monster. The psychological part came when it was time to dig the boar out of the snow. Instead of simply freeing it into the cage, Heracles constantly talked to the creature as he worked. He didn't expect understanding, but he hoped the sound of a calm, even voice might somehow influence its rage-clouded mind. "Easy, friend," he would say, as he shoveled snow away from the boar's massive sides. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. Being trapped is frightening, but I'm not here to harm you. I'm here to give you a chance to be something more than just an instrument of destruction." Whether the mighty boar actually understood or simply exhausted itself in futile struggle, something truly astonishing happened during the long and painstaking excavation process. The creature's incessant roaring and furious thrashing gradually subsided and ceased. By the time Heracles cleared away the last layer of snow, the Erymanthian boar was utterly calm, observing him with a gaze that still burned with fury, yet also held a flicker, perhaps even of curiosity. The journey back to Tiryns stretched for many weeks, and it became a kind of schooling for both the great hero and the captured monster. Heracles learned with surprise that even the fiercest creature has basic needs: food, reliable shelter, and something that could almost be called a semblance of friendship or companionship, beyond the drive for destruction. The boar, for its part, seemed to begin to realize that not every human was a sworn enemy to be immediately annihilated. By the time they arrived at the palace, an unparalleled event unfolded. The Erymanthian boar, though still confined in its cage, no longer thrashing wildly against its bars, allowed Heracles to approach close enough to scratch it behind the ears, performing an act of trust. This was still a lethally dangerous creature, Its tusks could tear a man to shreds in mere moments. However, its unwavering, all-consuming rage had been replaced by a state closely resembling placidity. Eurystheus, observing the scene from his secure bronze chamber with the aid of a periscope, could hardly believe his own eyes. "How?" he demanded, requiring an explanation. "How did you transform this monster into what it now is?" Heracles thoughtfully weighed the question before giving his answer. "I think perhaps it was never truly a monster. Perhaps it was simply a creature that had suffered and lived in fear for so long that rage became its only way of interacting with the world. When I showed it that life didn't have to be a constant struggle, it remembered other, more peaceful ways of being. The boar spent the remainder of its days in a specially constructed enclosure in the royal gardens, where it became a sort of curiosity and local attraction. Children came to feed it juicy apples and watch it wallow in the mud. It never again displayed the all-consuming, destructive rage that had once terrorized the slopes of Mount Erymanthus. But as Heracles contemplated this peaceful scene, he couldn't help but reflect on the lessons embedded in this seemingly simple labor. If even the fiercest and most merciless creature could find peace when shown patience and proper respect, what did this imply about human nature itself? What prospects for atonement did this open for one who had committed truly terrible deeds? And, perhaps most importantly, as he prepared for the next new trial, what would happen when what needed pacifying was not a monster, but the corruption and moral filth that inevitably accumulate when people stop considering the consequences of their actions? The peaceful image of the transformed boar, placidly grazing in the royal gardens, was still fresh in Heracles' mind when Eurystheus summoned him for the fifth labour. This time, however, there was something entirely different in the king's voice. A distinct note of peculiar, sardonic satisfaction, unambiguously hinting that this task might prove to be the most humiliating of all. "Your next task," Eurystheus announced, without leaving his bronze chamber, his words exuding unconcealed glee, "is to clean the stables of King Augeas, and to do so in a single day. Every last one brought to impeccable, shining cleanliness." Now, one might reasonably ask why a simple stable cleaning could be considered a worthy commission for the greatest hero in all of Hellas. However, Eurystheus had thoroughly done his research and fully understood precisely what he was demanding. King Augeas of Elis possesses countless herds of cattle, outnumbering any other holding in the world. 3,000 prime head of the finest cattle to be found on earth, and he has never bothered to clean their stables, not once in 30 entire years. Imagine, if you can, the accumulated filth from 3,000 head of cattle over 3 decades. The stables are not merely dirty, they are rather geological formations of dung, layer upon layer of waste that has built up until the original floor was completely buried under 30 feet of these foul deposits. The stench from these stables could be detected for miles around, and the swarms of flies constantly buzzing above them formed dense clouds that were visible even from neighbouring kingdoms. However, the true genius of Eurystheus's cruelty lay in the time frame he set. Just one day. A task that would have required hundreds of men many months of arduous labour was to be completed from sunrise to sunset by a single individual. This was not merely physically impossible. It was designed solely to demoralize and humiliate the great hero, reducing him to the status of the lowliest servant. As Heracles set off for Elis, he had ample time for deep reflection on the implications of this humiliating labour. His previous trials had tested his physical strength, fearlessness, patience, and wisdom. This one, it seemed, was designed purely for his public degradation. Yet perhaps this was where its true importance lay. Perhaps learning to find dignity even in the most humble and unassuming work was an integral part of his journey toward full atonement. The suffocating stench assailed him long before the stables themselves came into view. It was a smell so deep and multifaceted that it seemed to consist of many layers. The sharp, acrid aroma of fresh excrement, the heavy, earthy richness of decades-old rot, and beneath it all, something so fundamentally putrid that it brought tears to the eyes and turned the stomach. When Heracles finally arrived at King Algaeus' palace, he found a ruler who seemed genuinely embarrassed and ashamed by his notorious neglect of cleanliness. Algaeus, in many respects, was a virtuous man, generous to his guests, just to his subjects, and renowned for the outstanding quality of his cattle. However, in some incomprehensible way, the task of cleaning the stables was constantly deferred until tomorrow, and this tomorrow had stretched into 30 long years. "I know how it looks," Algaeus said, avoiding Heracles' direct gaze as they surveyed the monumental mess together. "I kept meaning to hire men to finally deal with the problem, but the sheer volume of work became so colossal that I simply didn't know where to begin. And the expense. Can you imagine how much it would cost to hire enough labourers to manually move all that mass? Heracles attempts to walk through the stables, or at least makes an attempt. In most places, the accumulated waste nearly reaches the roof itself, leaving only narrow, winding passages between towering walls of filth. The cattle themselves, incidentally, had adapted perfectly to such conditions, living primarily outdoors and using the stables only in the most inclement weather. They appeared quite healthy, but the waste from their daily lives only exacerbated an already ever-growing problem. Standing amidst this grand monument to human procrastination, Heracles faced a true crisis in his approach. His usual methods, brute force, unwavering determination, direct and frontal action, would be utterly inadequate here. Even if he worked tirelessly from dawn to dusk, he could not manually move a tenth of this colossal mess. This labour demanded a fundamentally different approach. It required innovation, ingenuity. Heracles spent the remainder of the day methodically surveying the lands adjacent to the stables, studying the local geography with the eyes of an experienced engineer, not a mere warrior. He noted that two mighty rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus, flowed relatively close to the stables themselves. Even more significantly, he saw that with some highly creative earthworks, their courses could be temporarily diverted to flow directly through these filth-ridden buildings. That evening he presented his daring plan to King Algaeus. "I can clean your stables in just one day," he said, "but I will need your help to prepare. Grant me 50 of your men for this night, and by tomorrow evening your stables will be impeccably clean." Algaeus, who had been in despair after decades of shame, immediately gave his consent. "If you truly manage to perform this miracle," he said, "I will give you a tenth of my cattle as payment for your labour. 300 of the finest animals in all of Hellas." Heracles accepted this offer, though he knew perfectly well that he could not actually keep the payment for himself. The labours he was performing were for penance, not for personal gain. However, the promise of such a reward, served as additional motivation to secure the necessary assistance. All night, Heracles and these 50 labourers dug with such incredible focus and intensity that it astonished even these men, long accustomed to arduous physical labour. They are not merely moving tons of earth. They are, in fact, reshaping the very landscape, creating new channels capable of diverting the courses of 2 large rivers toward a single goal. The work was exhausting, yet there was something profoundly satisfying, giving a sense of purpose to it. These men had lived for years feeling shame over their king's filthy stables, unable to tackle the problem due to its truly colossal scale. Now, finally, they were taking decisive action that would forever put an end to this problem. As dawn broke, the final, crucial preparations were completed. 2 meticulously engineered channels, like arteries, led from the rivers directly to the stables, equipped with massive wooden gates ready to regulate the powerful flow of water. Additional channels located on the far side would divert the water and everything it carried safely downstream, channeling it into agricultural areas where this waste could actually benefit the land, acting as valuable fertilizer. The moment of truth arrived as the sun reached its highest point at zenith. Heracles and his assistants simultaneously flung open the gates, and the combined might of the 2 rivers, like a mighty cleansing flood, surged through the Augean stables. What unfolded next was truly impressive and deeply satisfying all at once. 30 years of accumulated filth were washed away in a matter of hours. The swift current of water scoured the pristine floors, revealing walls that had not seen light in decades, and carried away the monumental mess that had only recently seemed utterly insoluble. But this was not merely the destruction of the old. This was a genuine renewal. As the continuous flow of water continued to rush through the stables, it accomplished something truly astonishing. The ancient deposits of waste, mingled with the rapidly moving river water, transformed into rich, valuable fertilizer that would greatly benefit the farmlands for miles downstream. What had seemed only pervasive corruption and a problem was transformed into something useful and beneficial. By midday, the work was completely finished. Where once stood stables so foul that their stench could be detected even from neighbouring kingdoms, now stood clean buildings with stone floors, glistening wetly under the sun's rays. The rivers were returned to their original courses, leaving behind structures that were not merely clean, but entirely renewed, as if born anew. King Augeas was overcome with a deep sense of jubilation and colossal relief, so strong that his eyes filled with tears. 30 years, he incessantly exclaimed. A full 30 years I endured this unbearable disgrace, and you managed to resolve it in a single day. Without delay, he ordered his servants to deliver 300 choice cows from his herd, thus fulfilling his promise of reward. However, it was at this moment that Heracles found himself facing an unforeseen moral dilemma. He had impeccably completed the task, strictly following all instructions. The stables gleamed with cleanliness. All the work had been finished within one day, and in many ways this was made possible by his personal efforts and meticulous planning. But there was another aspect. Heracles had made an agreement with Augeas that implied personal gain for him, which seemed to contradict the true spirit of atonement underlying his heroic labours. After prolonged internal torment, Heracles arrived at a conclusion that astonished everyone around him, including himself. He accepted the offered cattle, but immediately began distributing them. He gave some to the labourers who had assisted with the earthworks, and others to needy farmers in the vicinity who required cattle to feed their families. He kept not a single animal for himself. When news of this unusual act reached Eurystheus's ears, the king's reaction was immediate and entirely predictable. "This labour cannot be counted," he categorically declared. "Heracles received payment for the work done, which transforms it into a mere commercial operation, not an act of penance." Moreover, he resorted to the help of rivers to perform the main part of the cleaning itself, which means he did not accomplish the task solely through his own efforts. This was indeed a harsh and unyielding decision, further exacerbated by its pedantic technical justification. However, as Heracles was about to leave the courtyard, King Augeas pulled him aside for a confidential conversation. "I don't care what your cousin proclaims," Augeas said softly. "What you accomplished here went far beyond merely cleaning stables. You showed me that no problem is so vast that it cannot be solved, provided one is willing to think creatively and work diligently. You restored my dignity and transformed something shameful into something truly valuable. These are the deeds of a true hero." Leaving the now pristine stables, Heracles fell into deep reflection on the lessons he had learned from this unusual labour. He realized that sometimes the most significant work is not outwardly flashy. Sometimes heroism lies in finding innovative solutions to problems that everyone else deems utterly hopeless. And often the greatest triumph is not so much in the achievement itself as in the dignity one manages to maintain while performing the necessary task. However, as he headed back to Tiryns, he couldn't help but wonder what new trial awaited him. If Eurystheus was becoming increasingly sophisticated in his ruthlessness, rejecting already completed labours for technical reasons, what impossible task would be designed to test not only his physical capabilities, but his very understanding of what it means to serve others? The refusal to acknowledge his labour of cleaning the stables wounded Heracles far more deeply than he might have expected. As he approached King Eurystheus's palace for the 6th time, there was a previously unknown heaviness in his stride. He was slowly coming to realize that no matter how flawlessly he completed these commissions, his treacherous cousin would always find pretexts to prolong his torment. But perhaps this was where the true meaning lay. Perhaps true atonement is measured not by the number of labours completed, but solely by the unwavering willingness to continue serving, despite the injustice inflicted. From his secure bronze chamber, Eurystheus's voice resonated, carrying a barely contained anticipation. He had been planning this new trial for many months, even consulting with the goddess Hera herself. To be absolutely certain, this labour would subject Heracles to tests unlike any of his previous deeds. "Your 6th labour," the king solemnly proclaimed, "is to drive the Stymphalian birds from the vast swamps surrounding Lake Stymphalus. These monstrous creatures have terrorized the entire region for years, rendering it completely unsuitable for safe habitation." At first glance, it might seem that birds posed no particular threat, especially after heroic battles with monsters like the Hydra and the capture of creatures like the Erymanthian boar. However, the Stymphalian birds were by no means ordinary fowl. They were the size of cranes, but possessed metallic feathers, sharp as sword blades, and bronze beaks capable of piercing even the strongest armour. Their penchant for human flesh had earned them a reputation as the most terrifying predators in all of Arcadia. These creatures hunted in vast flocks, numbering in the hundreds, and when they took to the sky, they literally eclipsed the sunlight. Their metallic feathers could be launched like arrows, raining deadly hail from above upon anyone who dared to trespass on their territory. What was most frightening was their astonishing intelligence. The birds were cunning enough to employ complex strategy, working together to corner prey, and using their numbers to overwhelm even well-equipped hunting parties. Heracles' journey to Lake Stymphalus led him through increasingly desolate rural landscapes. Villages that had once thrived in this region now stood abandoned. Their inhabitants had hastily fled their homes, seeking refuge in safer areas. Farmlands lay fallow, their fields gradually overgrown with wild vegetation. Even the roads showed clear signs of disuse, as travellers had long learned to bypass this dangerous area entirely. As Heracles drew closer to the lake itself, the evidence of these feathered predators became absolutely undeniable. Trees stood bare, not from the change of seasons, but from countless scratches of metallic talons. The ground was literally strewn with bones, both animal and human, meticulously picked clean by sharp bronze beaks. But the most unsettling sight was the metallic feathers, embedded in tree trunks and scattered across the landscape, gleaming ominously in the sunlight, resembling a field covered in knives. The lake itself, under different circumstances, could have been a place of astonishing beauty. Fed by crystal-clear mountain streams, it formed a perfect circle of transparent water, surrounded by marshes that should normally have teemed with diverse wild flora and fauna. Instead of the expected abundance of sounds, a dead silence reigned here, broken only by an occasional ripple across the water's surface. This silent environment was so pervasive that even Heracles' own footsteps sounded unnaturally loud. However, he knew perfectly well the birds were here. Birds. Somewhere among the dense reeds and tall grasses that fringed the lake, hundreds of deadly creatures were intently watching his approach. He felt their attention as a physical weight, and shivers ran down his spine from the unshakable certainty that he was being assessed as potential prey. Heracles wisely set up his camp on a small elevated hill overlooking the marsh. This spot was close enough to observe the birds' habits, yet far enough to avoid a sudden and immediate attack. As dusk fell, he witnessed for the first time what he was about to face. The birds flew out for their evening hunt, resembling a living storm embodied in flesh. They rose from the reeds in a single coordinated mass that momentarily obscured the setting sun. Their metallic feathers made a sound like 1,000 swords being sharpened simultaneously. Their movements were executed with such precision that they spoke of high intelligence and years of practice. They fanned out to cover the entire marsh area before commencing their systematic search for food. Observing their coordinated work, Heracles began to grasp the true scale of his trial. These were not just dangerous animals, this was an organized, lethal force that had turned this entire region into its exclusive hunting ground. Direct confrontation with them would be tantamount to suicide, like charging into a hail of bronze arrows while being attacked by hundreds of swift flying blades. However, his evening observation revealed something crucial to Heracles. The greatest strength of these birds was simultaneously their most significant weakness. They moved as a single flock, thinking and acting as one collective entity. If he could find a way to disrupt this flawless coordination, To scatter them in a panic rather than engaging an organized army, he might have a chance at success. It was that night, as Heracles sat by his small campfire, that a completely unexpected ally appeared before him. Athena herself, the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, manifested in the flickering flames. She spoke no words, but left behind an invaluable gift that later proved indispensable to his success. It was a pair of bronze castanets, forged by the skillful Hephaestus himself. At first, Heracles could not at all comprehend the significance of this unusual offering. Castanets were, after all, merely musical instruments typically used by dancers and performers. How could they help him in confronting a flock of deadly birds? But upon closer inspection he began to realize their divine craftsmanship. When struck together, they produced a sound utterly unlike anything he had heard before, pure, piercing, and in some profound way disturbing. The next morning, Heracles proceeded to test his hypothesis. Standing at the very edge of the marsh, he struck the castanets together with monstrous force. The sound produced was truly extraordinary. It was not merely loud, but somehow wrong, like the agonizing scream of a creature that did not belong in this world. The echo of this sound reverberated across the water and through the reeds with such intensity that it seemed to shake the very air. The effect on the birds was instantaneous and devastating. They burst from their hiding places in absolute panic. Their usual coordination was completely shattered by this alien sound. Instead of forming their usual hunting formation, they scattered in all directions, colliding with each other and filling the air with chaotic, confused cries. Heracles, however, knew perfectly well that this was only the very beginning. The sound, while dispersing the birds, by no means banished them forever. As soon as the last echoes faded, they would surely regroup and return, likely even more formidable than before, for now they would be not only hungry, but also filled with rage. What followed was one of the most extraordinary battles ever described in heroic literature. Heracles spent the entire day tirelessly moving around the lake, continuously using the castanets to keep the birds in constant motion. Each time they attempted to land and regroup, he would strike the bronze instruments together again, once more throwing them into absolute panic. This was exhausting work, requiring strategic thinking and physical strength in equal measure. Heracles had to maintain his mobility tirelessly, anticipating potential gathering spots for the birds and taking positions that could effectively disrupt their attempts at reorganization. Using the castanets also required extreme precision. Overuse would diminish their effect, while insufficient frequency would allow the birds to regain their formation. As the day progressed, something truly astonishing began to happen. The continuous tension and constant confusion gradually undermined the birds' collective behavior. Individual birds began to break away from the main flock, soaring into the sky in search of calmer and safer places. What had once appeared to be a coordinated army was steadily transforming into a scattered collection of frightened creatures. By evening, the once majestic flock of Stymphalian birds had dwindled to a few dozen stragglers, and even these seemed more concerned with flight than with maintaining control of their territory. Heracles struck the castanets decisively one last time, and the remaining birds, caught in a surge of fear, soared towards distant mountain peaks, their piercing cries gradually fading into the encroaching silence. The transformation of the swamp was instantaneous and profound. With the disappearance of the constant threat posed by the deadly birds, other wildlife began to return almost immediately. Fish splashed merrily in the lake. Frogs heartily began their evening chorus. And even a few graceful deer ventured to the water's edge to quench their thirst. The natural balance, disrupted for many years, began to restore itself within just a few hours. However, the true measure of Heracles' success was revealed in the days that followed, as news of the birds' departure spread throughout the region. Farmers returned to their abandoned, once fertile lands. Travellers once again fearlessly used the roads. Children who had never in their lives seen the lake without fear, for the first time in their lives, swam in its clear, sparkling waters. As Heracles returned to Tiryns, he carried with him several metallic feathers, shed by the birds in their panicked flight. These feathers served as undeniable proof of his triumph, but also symbolized something more. A testament that even the most deeply entrenched problems can be resolved with the right combination of wisdom, perseverance, and of course, divine assistance. This time, King Eurystheus could find no fault in the impeccably executed labour. The birds were gone, the region was safe, and the task had been accomplished through Heracles' own efforts and ingenuity. The king grudgingly accepted the provided evidence, but could not deny that the sixth labour had been successfully completed. However, as Heracles prepared to leave the palace, he noticed something unsettling. Eurystheus' frustration at being unable to find a flaw in this labour had been replaced by a new, ominous determination. The king was studying scrolls and maps with an intensity that clearly portended the next trial would be even more dangerous and insidious than all the previous ones. Standing in the palace courtyard and listening to the quiet whispers of Eurystheus and his advisers, Heracles realized that his labours might be teaching him valuable lessons. But they were also, to his horror, teaching his enemies how to create increasingly sophisticated and cruel torments. The question that haunted him as he left the palace was this: what would happen when wisdom and courage were not enough? What trial could test not only his physical and mental abilities, but his very notion of what is even possible? Success in dealing with the Stymphalian birds had imbued Heracles with a confidence he hadn't felt since the beginning of his labours. He had learned to combine brute force with strategic thinking, to graciously accept divine assistance, and to find solutions that not only destroyed, but also restored. However, as he once again stood before Eurystheus' bronze chamber, he sensed that this hard-won wisdom would be tested in entirely new, unpredictable ways. "Your seventh labour," Eurystheus announced, hints of barely contained malice in his voice, "will take you far from Greece. You must travel to the island of Crete and capture the bull that terrorizes King Minos and his people. Bring it back alive and unharmed." At first glance, this might have seemed straightforward enough. Another capture mission, similar to that of the boar or the hind, but Eurystheus knew precisely what he was asking for, and the cunning smile in his voice suggested this task held complexities that wouldn't reveal themselves until Heracles was already fully committed to attempting it. The Cretan bull was no ordinary creature. It was the magnificent animal that the god Poseidon had sent from the sea as a sign of divine favour to King Minos many years ago. White as the foam on ocean waves and incredibly beautiful, it was intended as a sacrifice in honour of the sea god. However, Minos, captivated by the bull's extraordinary beauty, decided to keep it for himself, sacrificing a lesser animal in its place. Poseidon's wrath, ignited by this deception, transformed the bull from a creature of divine beauty into something far more dangerous. Still magnificent in appearance, it now possessed the strength to demolish buildings, the speed to outrun even horses, and a temper so unpredictable that it attacked without warning or apparent reason. The journey to Crete provided Heracles with much-needed time to ponder the broader implications of this labour. For the first time he was sent beyond mainland Greece, away from familiar territories and established support systems. If something went wrong, if he was injured or needed help, he would be entirely dependent on strangers in a foreign land. However, the sea voyage also granted him something he hadn't experienced in months: solitude and peace. Standing at the ship's rail and watching playful dolphins frolic in the wake, Heracles found he could think clearly about his journey thus far. Each labour had taught him something new, and a pattern was slowly emerging. He was learning that heroism was not solely about displaying strength or fearless courage. It was, above all, about understanding the nature of the challenges he faced, the needs of the people he served, and the complex web of motivations driving both gods and mortals. This growing wisdom was perhaps the most valuable thing he had gained from his trials. Crete, when it appeared on the horizon, was precisely as legends described it. The island rose from the sea like a jewel, with white buildings cascading down hillsides to harbours filled with ships from across the known world. It was the centre of a thriving maritime empire, a place where cultures mingled and innovation flourished. But even from the harbour, clear signs of the bull's rampage were visible. A section of the city's outer wall had been breached, leaving a gap filled with temporary wooden barriers. Several buildings bore damage from what could only have been the impact of something massive and unstoppable. Most telling of all, the streets that should have been bustling with commerce were almost empty, as if the populace was hiding indoors. King Minos received Heracles in a throne room that spoke volumes of wealth and power. However, the king himself displayed clear tension from the burden of a problem he could not solve. Dark circles under Minos's eyes spoke of countless sleepless nights, and his hands trembled slightly as he described the situation. "The bull appears without warning," Minos explained, his voice strained with deep frustration. "Sometimes it behaves docilely for days, peacefully grazing in our fields. Then, suddenly, it becomes pure destructive force. It has destroyed 3 granaries, demolished the main bridge into the city, and killed 7 of our best warriors who tried to subdue it." As Minos continued his narrative, it became clear that the bull's unpredictability was its most dangerous characteristic. Unlike other creatures Heracles had faced, this one could not be tracked or predicted. It could spend a week acting like the most ordinary animal, then suddenly descend upon inhabited areas with destructive force. Heracles spent several days observing the bull from a safe distance, trying to understand a pattern in its behaviour. What he discovered deeply troubled him. No pattern existed. The creature seemed to switch between peaceful grazing and destructive rage based on internal triggers that no external observer could predict or influence. But on the 4th day of observation, Heracles witnessed something that profoundly changed his understanding of the entire situation. He watched as the bull grazed quietly in a meadow, when a group of children, ignoring their parents' warnings, approached to get a closer look at the famous creature. Instead of attacking, the bull allowed them to approach. It even seemed to enjoy their attention, lowering its massive head for them to pet its soft white muzzle. For almost an hour, the scene remained perfectly peaceful. Children played with perhaps the most dangerous animal in the Mediterranean. Then, without any visible external trigger, something shifted in the bull's demeanor. Its eyes, which had been calm and intelligent, suddenly blazed with fury. The children, sensing this change, fled in terror as the bull began to demolish everything within reach. Trees, rocks, even the massive stone wall that bordered the meadow. Watching this startling transformation, Heracles began to understand what he was truly up against. This was not merely an evil animal. This was a creature torn between its original divine nature and the corruption imposed by Poseidon's curse. The bull experienced periods of its true self, which were inevitably followed by episodes where divine wrath completely overwhelmed its natural disposition. This insight pointed to a strategy that differed starkly from the usual direct confrontation. Instead of attempting to subdue the bull during its periods of uncontrollable rage, the hero decided to approach it during one of its calm states and make an attempt to maintain that serenity through extremely careful handling. An opportune moment presented itself 3 days later. The bull was peacefully grazing alone in one of the remote valleys, at a significant distance from any settlements that might suffer if something went wrong. Heracles approached slowly and completely openly, making no attempt to conceal himself or deceive the animal. He wanted the bull to clearly see his approach and decide its reaction independently. The majestic animal raised its head and observed the approaching Heracles intently, displaying curiosity rather than hostility. When the hero stopped about 20 feet away and sat on a conveniently placed boulder, the bull, to his surprise, approached closer, as if seeking interaction. What followed was one of the most unusual hours ever described in heroic literature. Heracles and the Cretan bull simply spent time together, with no ulterior motive beyond mutual companionship. The hero quietly recounted his many journeys, his valiant deeds, and his deep hopes for eventual atonement. The bull listened with every sign of understanding, occasionally emitting soft sounds that might well have been attempts at communication. It was during this pacifying interlude that Heracles made his move, not using ropes or brute force, but merely a simple request. "My friend," he addressed the bull, "I need to take you on a journey, not to harm you, but to help both you and the people of this island. Will you come with me willingly?" The bull's reaction was truly extraordinary. It approached and gently pressed its massive head against Heracles' chest, demonstrating a gesture of trust that brought tears to the hero's eyes. Without any further coercion, the great animal followed Heracles back to the harbour, treading as calmly as an ordinary domestic cow. Loading the bull onto the ship, bound for mainland Greece, became a veritable public celebration. The people of Crete, finally liberated from years of fear, gathered to witness the peaceful departure of the creature that had terrorized them for so long. Children who, just days before, had scattered in panic, now waved goodbye to the bull as if bidding farewell to an old friend. However, the real test for Heracles' approach was to come during the sea voyage. Confined on the ship, with no possibility of escape, everyone on board would be in grave danger if the bull's violent phase returned, or if the divine curse reasserted itself. For 3 days the bull remained calm, seemingly even enjoying the sea breeze and the rhythmic rocking of the waves. On the 4th day, however, the inevitable occurred. The bull's eyes suddenly blazed with the familiar fury, and it began to struggle desperately against its bonds. But this time, instead of fleeing or preparing for battle, Heracles did something utterly unexpected. He approached the raging animal and began to hum a soft, wordless melody that his mother used to sing to him as a child. The effect was gradual but utterly unmistakable. The bull's struggles grew less ferocious. Its breathing slowed, and gradually its eyes returned to their normal, intelligent expression. The divine rage receded, once again giving way to the creature's true nature. When they reached Tiryns, Heracles presented the bull to Eurystheus not as a captured monster, but as a transformed creature, perfectly capable of coexisting peacefully among humans. The demonstration was quite convincing. The bull allowed itself to be led into a temporary enclosure and showed no signs of the violence that had once terrorized Crete. This time Eurystheus had no grounds to reject the completed labor. The bull had been captured alive and unharmed, brought back to mainland Greece and delivered in a state posing no threat to anyone. The 7th labor was, undeniably, successfully completed, but as Heracles prepared to leave, he couldn't help but notice the calculating glint in his cousin's eyes. The king was beginning to realize that ordinary trials were no longer sufficient to break his increasingly capable relative. Whatever came next, it would have to test not only Heracles' physical capabilities but his very soul. Standing in the peaceful courtyard and watching the Cretan bull graze calmly alongside the transformed Erymanthian boar, Heracles reflected on how much he had learned about the boundless power of patience and deep understanding. But deep down, he knew that these gentler lessons were preparing him for trials that would demand all the wisdom he had ever acquired. The question that haunted him in quiet moments was simple, yet terrifying. What would happen when understanding and compassion were not enough? What trial could break even a hero who had learned to see the divine spark in every creature he encountered? The sight of the bull and boar peacefully grazing in Eurystheus's courtyard instilled in the king a new and profoundly unsettling understanding of his cousin's developing abilities. Heracles wasn't just growing stronger or more skilled in combat. He was fundamentally transforming, finding ways to turn monsters into companions. This development threatened everything Eurystheus and Hera had long hoped to achieve with these labors. From his bronze chamber, the king's voice carried a note of desperate, yet malicious triumph. Your 8th labor will take you to Thrace, to the kingdom of the cruel King Diomedes. You must steal his 4 mares and bring them to me. These are no ordinary horses. They are the fiercest creatures in all the world, and Diomedes feeds them human flesh to maintain their incredible strength and savagery. The implications of this task struck Heracles like a physical blow. For the first time, he was being asked to steal, not to capture or kill. Even more disturbingly, he was being sent to confront creatures that had been deliberately corrupted by the systematic feeding of human victims. This was not about taming monsters or solving problems of nature. This was about confronting pure, unadulterated evil and finding some way to redeem it. But there was something else about this task that troubled Heracles even more deeply. Diomedes of Thrace was known throughout Greece as one of the cruelest and most merciless tyrants. a man who revelled in torture and regarded human life as a mere trifle. The mares were not simply dangerous animals, they served as instruments of his extreme cruelty, fed to the flesh of his enemies and innocent victims. As Heracles prepared for the journey to Thrace, he made a decision that proved crucial to the outcome of the labour. Instead of travelling alone, he asked his nephew Iolaus and several other young heroes to accompany him. If he was to confront systematic evil, he reasoned, he would certainly need companions who shared his unwavering commitment to justice and human dignity. The journey north became sobering as they delved deeper into Diomedes' territory. The signs of his tyranny became utterly impossible to ignore. Villages were fortified like military encampments, their inhabitants peering fearfully from behind barricaded doors. Roads were patrolled by heavily armed soldiers who regarded travellers with obvious suspicion. Most disturbing of all, they passed several execution sites where the bones of Diomedes' victims lay scattered and unburied. Diomedes' palace, when they finally reached it, was a fortress designed more for intimidation than for any display of beauty. Black stone walls rose sharply from the surrounding plain, topped with sharp iron spikes. The main gate was flanked by the heads of recent victims left to rot as a grim warning to anyone who might dare oppose the king's will. But it was the stables that truly revealed the full horror of what Heracles had to face. Diomedes' 4 mares were kept in a special enclosure, surrounded by 20-foot-high walls. The enclosure reeked of death and decay, and the ground was strewn with human bones, gnawed clean by horse teeth. The mares themselves were both magnificent and horrifying, larger than ordinary horses with eyes blazing with intelligence and malice. Watching the mares eat fresh meat brought by Diomedes' servants, Heracles realized he was confronted with something unprecedented in his labours. These were not creatures corrupted by a divine curse or driven mad by supernatural influence. These were animals that had been systematically perverted by human cruelty, taught to crave the flesh of Heracles' own kind. That evening, as Heracles and his companions camped outside the city, a group of refugees approached them, people who had escaped Diomedes' tyranny and now lived as outlaws in the wilderness. Their leader, an elderly man named Abdir, told them stories that made even the battle-hardened heroes feel sick. He feeds them anyone who displeases him, Abdir explained, his voice hollow with past horror. Political prisoners, debtors who can't pay, sometimes just people who looked at him the wrong way. The mares have learned to associate human screams with feeding time. They get excited when they hear people cry out in fear. But Abdir also provided crucial information about the mares' keeping and care. For all their corruption, they were still horses with their equine needs and behaviours. They had favourite foods besides human flesh, preferred resting spots, and individual personalities. This knowledge gave Heracles hope that redemption was still possible. The plan that emerged from their night discussions was complex and extremely dangerous. Instead of simply stealing the mares, they would attempt to liberate the entire city from Diomedes' tyrannical rule. The tyrant's death would free his people and remove the source of the mares' corruption. But this meant Heracles would be fighting not only monsters, but an entire system of organized evil. At dawn, as the first rays of sun barely touched the horizon, Heracles and his comrades launched a decisive attack, simultaneously assaulting the royal palace and the adjacent stables. While the main contingent of the force engaged in fierce combat with Diomedes' guards in the central square, Heracles himself infiltrated the enclosure where the renowned mares were kept. He carried no customary weapons, his hands were occupied with an entirely different arsenal, ripe, sweet apples and fresh grain. These simple gifts were intended to awaken in the corrupted creatures memories of their true, inherent nature. The confrontation with these mares proved to be an entirely unprecedented experience for Heracles, unlike any of his past labours. These animals were not merely seeking to kill him. Their sole and all-consuming purpose was to devour his flesh. They charged with bared jaws, and in their eyes burned a wild, cannibalistic hunger, terrifying in its primal force. Heracles, however, did not defend himself in the usual sense. Instead, he made a sharp dash to the side, liberally scattering grain and apples on the ground. The mares, expecting a feast of human flesh, suddenly found themselves faced with a perplexing choice: to follow their acquired, unnatural craving or to succumb to their long-forgotten, yet still living natural instincts. For a moment they froze in utter confusion, their nostrils flaring convulsively as they tried to comprehend the unfamiliar, long-forgotten scent of ordinary horse feed. One of them, perhaps less deeply corrupted than the others, cautiously approached the scattered apples. She sniffed them distrustfully, then took a tentative experimental bite. The sweetness of the fruits seemed to awaken something that had slumbered for years, a vague but powerful memory of what horses are meant to eat, of what they are truly meant to be. But this fragile moment of progress was brutally interrupted by the sudden appearance of Diomedes himself. The tyrant, having broken through the defensive lines, burst into the stable complex, consumed by furious rage at the encroachment on his precious possessions. In his hand he clutched a whip studded with iron spikes, an instrument he had used countless times to drive the mares into a frenzy. "You dare to steal from me," Diomedes roared, raising the whip high above his head. "I will feed you to them piecemeal, and they will thank me for it." The events that followed unfolded swiftly and were filled with horror. Diomedes brought the whip down on Heracles, but the hero, possessing incredible strength, caught it with his bare hand. The iron spikes dug deep into his palm, yet he did not loosen his grip. Instead, he yanked the tyrant forward, throwing him off balance and making him vulnerable. The ensuing struggle was short but decisive. Diomedes, for all his cruelty, was no match for one with Heracles' strength and combat training. Moments later, the tyrant lay unconscious on the floor of his own stable, surrounded by the mares he himself had turned into instruments of terror. However, the true nature of this labour was defined by what happened next. The mares, seeing their tormentor helpless, approached him with obvious intent. They had been trained to perceive human weakness as an invitation to feast, and Diomedes had provided them with countless victims over the years. Heracles was faced with a terrible choice. He could stop the mares, protecting even this evil man from the fate he had inflicted on so many others. Or he could allow justice to take its natural course, letting the tyrant experience precisely what he had dealt to his victims. The decision, when it came, was dictated by everything Heracles had learned about the nature of heroism and atonement. He stood between the mares and the fallen tyrant, not to protect Diomedes, but to prevent the horses from further corrupting themselves with human flesh. "No," he told them firmly, spreading his arms to block their path. You are horses, not monsters. You eat grass, grain, and apples, not the flesh of men. Remember who you truly are. The intervention worked, partly due to Heracles' commanding presence, and partly because the earlier taste of apples had awakened the mare's dormant instincts. They retreated from the unconscious tyrant, though they continued to eye him with obvious hunger. With Diomedes defeated and his guards scattered, the city's liberation happened quickly. Refugees returned from the wilderness to reclaim their homes. Political prisoners were freed from the palace dungeons. Most importantly, the systematic feeding of human flesh to the mares immediately ceased. But Heracles knew perfectly well that simply removing the source of corruption could not instantly heal creatures that had been perverted for years. The journey back to Tiryns became a lengthy rehabilitation program, during which Heracles and his companions patiently worked to re-educate the mares in proper equine behaviour. This process was neither quick nor easy. The mares still showed flashes of their old savagery. They still sometimes looked at humans with hunger rather than trust. But gradually, through consistent kindness and proper food, they began to remember who they were meant to be. Young Abder, who had joined their company as an expert in caring for the mares, played a crucial role in this rehabilitation. He seemed to possess a natural understanding of horses, and under his patient guidance, the mares began to show signs of true healing. By the time they reached Tiryns, the transformation was astonishing. The mares still bore the physical signs of their corruption. They were larger and stronger than ordinary horses with unusually sharp teeth, but their behaviour had become recognizably equine. They grazed peacefully, responded to gentle handling, and showed no interest in human flesh. Eurystheus, watching from his bronze chamber as the 4 mares were peacefully led into the royal stables, could barely believe his eyes. "How?" he demanded an explanation. "How did you turn man-eating monsters into ordinary horses?" Heracles carefully considered the question before replying. "I think they were never true monsters. They were simply creatures taught to behave monstrously. When someone showed them another way of life, they gladly chose it. Sometimes evil is not a fundamental nature. Sometimes it is just terrible conditioning that can be corrected with patience and love." But even as he spoke these words, Heracles knew that his growing ability to rehabilitate corrupted creatures made his enemies increasingly desperate. The look in Eurystheus's eyes suggested that future labours would test not only his strength or wisdom, but his very commitment to the belief that any creature could be redeemed. And somewhere in the shadows, Hera watched and planned, understanding that direct corruption might not be enough to break this hero who found light, even in the deepest darkness. What trial could shake who had learned to see the spark of divinity even in the most perverted creations? The sight of Diomedes' former man-eating mares peacefully grazing alongside other transformed creatures in the royal stables brought Eurystheus to a new level of frustration. His cousin was not merely completing impossible tasks. He was transforming the very nature of what it meant to be monstrous. If this continued, Heracles might truly achieve the atonement he sought, something neither Eurystheus nor Hera could allow. This time, when the king's voice echoed from his bronze chamber, it carried a note of calculating cruelty that made even the guards shift uncomfortably. "Your 9th labour will test whether your newfound wisdom extends to matters of diplomacy and honour. You must travel to the land of the Amazons and procure the golden girdle of their queen Hippolyta. This girdle is a gift from Ares himself, and the queen will not part with it willingly. The implications of this task were immediately clear to Heracles. Unlike his previous labours, which involved creatures that could be fought or reasoned with according to their nature, this task placed him in potential conflict with an entire civilization of warrior women, renowned for their skill, courage, and fierce independence. The Amazons were not monsters to be tamed or problems to be solved. They were people with their own culture, values, and a legitimate claim to their property. But there was another aspect of this trial that troubled Heracles even more deeply. Hippolyta's girdle was not merely an adornment. It was a symbol of her authority, blessed by the god of war himself. To take it would be tantamount to stripping the queen of her crown, which would humiliate her before her people and potentially destabilize their entire society. As Heracles prepared for this journey, he made a decision that reflected how much he had learned from his previous labours. Instead of travelling with warriors who might view the Amazons as enemies to be conquered, he chose companions known for their diplomatic skills and respect for other cultures. This was to be a mission of negotiation, not a conquest. The journey to the Amazons' homeland led them across the Black Sea to shores few Greek men had ever seen. As their ship approached the coast, they saw evidence of a civilization unlike anything in their homeland. Cities were built with both beauty and defense in mind, showcasing the influence of warrior architects who understood that strength and elegance could coexist. But it was their first encounter with the Amazons themselves that truly impressed Heracles and his companions. A squadron of mounted warrior women intercepted their ship when it was still a mile from shore. These women moved with a precision and confidence that spoke of a lifetime of training and absolute trust in their abilities. Their leader, a tall woman with intricately braided hair and battle scars that attested to countless engagements, addressed them using accented but fluent Greek. "I am Antiope, sister of Queen Hippolyta," she solemnly proclaimed, her voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to unquestioning obedience. "State the purpose of your presence in our lands, Greeks. Have you come as merchants, diplomats, or enemies?" Heracles, in turn, replied with the formal courtesy befitting a representative of a sovereign people. "I am Heracles of Thebes, and I have come to request an audience with your queen on a matter of great personal significance to me. I bring gifts as a sign of respect and ask only for the opportunity to present my case to her." Such a diplomatic approach undoubtedly surprised Antiope, who likely rarely encountered Greek men capable of treating Amazons as equals. After a moment's consideration, she granted them safe passage to the capital. However, Heracles did not fail to notice that they were escorted by enough warriors to thwart any attempt at treachery. The Amazonian capital proved to be a revelation. Unlike Greek cities, where women's quarters were hidden from public view, here women held all positions of power and commanded universal respect. The city's architecture was a reflection of their values. Buildings were both functional and beautiful, designed by people who saw no contradiction between martial prowess and aesthetic sensibility. Queen Hippolyta received them in a throne room that was both majestic and grandly intimate. She appeared younger than Heracles had expected, perhaps only a few years his senior, but carried herself with the assurance of one who had never doubted her right to rule. The famous girdle of Ares gleamed at her waist, not ostentatious or showy, but clearly a work of divine craftsmanship. What followed was one of the most unusual conversations in heroic literature. Instead of making demands or offers, Heracles recounted his entire story to Hippolyta. The tragedy that led him to these labours, the lessons learned from each trial, and his growing understanding of what it truly meant to serve others. Hippolyta listened with the attention of one accustomed to making important decisions based on incomplete information. When Heracles finished his tale, she asked probing questions that revealed both her intelligence and a genuine interest in his spiritual journey. "So, you seek this girdle not as a trophy of conquest," she summarized, "but as a symbol that you have learned to obtain what you desire through respect, not force. You ask me to help you prove that you have surpassed the man who once solved every problem with his club." The accuracy of her assessment stunned Heracles. He had not articulated his request in such terms, but she had grasped the deeper meaning of what he was trying to achieve. This labour was not merely about completing a task. It was a demonstration that he had become someone worthy of the atonement he sought. What Hippolyta did next astonished everyone present, including her own advisers. She unbuckled the girdle of Ares and extended it to Heracles. "Take it," she simply said, "not as spoils of war or a price of negotiation, but as a gift freely given in honour of your journey to wisdom." But just as Heracles reached for the girdle, disaster struck from an unexpected quarter. Hera, watching from Olympus and enraged by this peaceful resolution, descended into the Amazonian capital in disguise. Moving through the crowd as an ordinary Amazon warrior, she spread rumours that the Greeks had come to abduct their queen, that Heracles' diplomatic approach was merely a ruse to weaken their defences. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The Amazon warriors, who moments ago had regarded their foreign guests with curiosity, suddenly saw them as a threat to be eliminated. Weapons were drawn, war cries erupted, and the peaceful negotiations erupted into chaotic skirmish. In the confusion, Heracles faced an impossible choice. He can use his strength to fight his way out, likely killing several Amazon warriors in the process. Or he could try to protect Hippolyta, attempting to restore order, risking not only his own life but the lives of his companions. What he actually did reflected everything he had learned about the nature of true heroism. Instead of drawing a weapon, he threw himself between Hippolyta and the advancing warriors, using his body as a shield, shouting for everyone to cease fighting. "This is madness," he cried, his voice cutting through the din of battle. "We came here in peace. Queen Hippolyta honoured us with her trust. Do not let a stranger's lies destroy what we have built together." But in the chaos of battle, words were not enough. An Amazonian spear thrown by a warrior who believed she was defending her queen struck Hippolyta in the shoulder. The wound was not fatal, but the sight of their queen's blood enraged the Amazons in a way no reasoning could quell. The battle that followed was unlike anything in Heracles' previous labours. He fought not against monsters or wild animals, but against skilled warrior women defending their homeland from what they believed was a deadly threat. Every Amazon he faced was someone's daughter, sister, or friend, a person with hopes, fears, and legitimate reasons to fight. Heracles and his companions fought with desperate restraint, trying to incapacitate rather than kill, aiming to create enough space to escape rather than achieve outright victory. But the Amazons showed no such mercy, believing they were fighting for their queen's life and their nation's independence. In the end, Hippolyta herself stopped the battle. Despite her wound, she rose to her feet and commanded her warriors to cease fighting. "Enough!" she cried, her voice carrying the absolute authority of a queen. "I gave this man my girdle freely. The attack on me came from treachery within our own ranks, not from our guests." The Amazons reluctantly lowered their weapons, though many continued to eye the Greeks with suspicion. In the sudden silence, Hippolyta approached Heracles and once again placed the girdle in his hands. But now it came not as a gift between friends, but as compensation for the tragedy that divine interference had inflicted upon them both. "Take it and go," she said softly, her voice filled with sadness. "You came here with honor and fought with restraint when you could have chosen slaughter. But your presence brings a chaos my people do not deserve. Perhaps someday, when the gods are less interested in our affairs, we can meet again as friends." The journey back to Tiryns was somber, marked by reflections on how quickly trust could be shattered and how divine intervention could corrupt even the noblest intentions. Heracles carried Hippolyta's girdle, but it felt heavy with the weight of lost opportunities and friendships poisoned by forces beyond mortal control. When he presented the girdle to Eurystheus, the king accepted it with obvious satisfaction. The labour was completed by all technical measures, but both cousins knew that something fundamental had changed. The easy confidence Heracles had built through his recent successes was shaken by the realization that even his best intentions could lead to tragedy when divine malice intervened. Standing in the palace courtyard after completing his 9th labour, Heracles reflected on the lessons hidden within this painful experience. He learned that wisdom and good intentions are not always enough, that some conflicts arise not from misunderstanding, but from the deliberate manipulation of forces greater than any mortal hero. But perhaps most importantly, he learned that sometimes the most heroic thing to do is to accept responsibility for consequences that were not intended. To carry the burden of another's pain and to continue serving, even when the gods themselves seemed determined to corrupt his efforts. The question that haunted him as he prepared for his 10th labour was this: how does one maintain hope and honour when the very forces that should uphold justice seem intent on destroying it? The weight of Hippolyta's girdle seemed to grow heavier with each passing day after Heracles' return from the land of the Amazons. What should have been a triumph felt more like a burden, a reminder of how divine interference could corrupt even the noblest intentions. As he approached Eurystheus' palace for his 10th labour, there was a weariness in Heracles' step that had not been there before. The weariness of one who had learned that doing good in a world where gods play cruel games is harder than any physical trial. From his underground chamber, Eurystheus' voice carried a note of satisfaction, suggesting he was well aware of his cousin's troubled mood. Hera had whispered to him about the Amazon incident, and he knew Heracles' confidence had been shaken. It is time to present a challenge that will push the hero further than he has ever been pushed before. Your 10th labour, the king announced, will take you to the very ends of the earth. You must travel to the island of Erythea, beyond the pillars of Heracles, and steal the cattle of Geryon. These are the finest cattle in existence, guarded by monsters and belonging to a being so powerful that even the gods speak of him with respect. The mention of the Pillars of Heracles, those majestic rocks that mark the boundary between the familiar Mediterranean and the boundless, uncharted ocean, inevitably plunges Heracles into deep contemplation. This is by no means just about physical distance, though the journey ahead promises to be the longest he has ever undertaken. It is a challenge that involves entering a different realm, existing beyond the familiar world where entirely different laws apply, and customary defences may prove utterly useless. Geryon himself is the embodiment of myth and nightmare. Born from a union of divine and monstrous bloodlines, he possesses 3 torsos from the waist up, each crowned with its own head, equipped with its own arms and endowed with an individual will. These 3 aspects do not always act in concert, making Geryon both more and less dangerous than an ordinary opponent, for one might overcome one of his bodies, only to find the other 2 striving with redoubled determination to destroy you. However, the greatest immediate threat comes from Geryon's cattle guardians. Orthus, the 2-headed dog, is Cerberus's own brother and an almost equally deadly creature. He can attack from 2 directions simultaneously, and his bite carries venom capable of felling even divine beings. Next is Eurytion, the herdsman, a man so skilled with weapons that he has never lost a fight, and so utterly devoted to his master that he would prefer death rather than allow anyone to harm the cattle under his protection. As Heracles prepares for this labour, he faces decisions that will define not only his immediate approach to the challenge, but also his profound understanding of what heroism truly means in a world where gods regularly interfere in mortal affairs. Should he set out alone, knowing it might be a suicidal mission, or should he assemble an entire army, turning the labour into a full-scale military campaign? Or perhaps there is a middle path that will allow for both his need for success and his growing desire to minimize harm to others. The decision he made clearly demonstrates how much he had learned from his previous labours. He would go to Erythea alone, but he would prepare for the journey with the same meticulous and thoughtful planning that had ensured his recent successes. This would not be a reckless pursuit of danger, but a methodical, calculated approach to what might be the most perilous trial of his life. The path to the Pillars of Heracles leads through lands that become increasingly alien as they move further from the familiar territories of Greece. The people he meets speak languages completely unknown to him, worship gods he has never heard of, and follow customs that seem almost incomprehensible to one raised in Hellenic culture. But it is when he reaches the majestic rocks marking the edge of the known world that Heracles truly grasps the grandeur of his undertaking. The Pillars of Heracles rise, like the legs of a Titan, above the wine-dark sea, and beyond them stretches an ocean so vast that it seems to curve into nothingness. Somewhere in this boundless void lies Erythea, and on this island graze the cattle that constitute the essence of his 10th labour. The problem of traversing such a distance by ordinary means seems insurmountable, until Heracles recalls a detail from his childhood lessons. Helios, the sun god, crosses the sky daily in a golden cup capable of sailing both through the air and on water. Every evening, this cup carries the weary god around the edge of the world, so that he can begin his journey anew the next morning. The plan born from this memory is audacious, surpassing anything Heracles had attempted before. He will wait until Helios completes his daily journey, then ask to borrow the sun god's golden cup for his own voyage to Erythea. This is a request bordering on blasphemy. Mortals do not typically make such demands of great deities. However, Heracles had learned that sometimes the impossible becomes possible when approached with due respect and compelling necessity. The encounter with Helios takes place at sunset on the westernmost rock of the Pillars. As the sun god prepares to begin his nightly journey around the edge of the world, Heracles approaches with the formal courtesy befitting a divine being, but also with the confidence of one who has learned to treat the gods as powerful allies rather than unapproachable overlords. "Lord Helios," he says, bowing deeply but without obsequiousness, "I come to you with a request that I know sounds presumptuous. I need to reach the island of Erythea to complete a labor imposed upon me as penance for past transgressions. Will you lend me your cup for this journey, knowing that I will return it unharmed and treat it with the respect due to divine property?" Helios, perhaps intrigued by the unusual nature of such a direct request from a mortal, considers the proposition with the careful attention of one who has seen all the world has to offer. "You ask much, son of Zeus," he finally says. "My cup has never carried a mortal across the waters at the edge of the world, but I have watched your labors with interest, and I approve of what you have learned about service and sacrifice. Very well. You may borrow my cup, but only for 3 days. If you do not return by then, you will be cast into waters where no mortal was ever meant to swim. Helios's golden cup is a true marvel, defying all notions of how vessels should function. It responds to thought rather than physical steering, moves by divine power rather than wind or oar, and somehow protects its passenger from the crushing forces that should destroy any mortal daring to enter the realm of the gods. The journey across the outer ocean is unlike anything Heracles had ever experienced. Here, at the edge of creation, familiar rules seemed suspended. Sea creatures the size of islands breached near the cup, showing not the slightest interest in this strange visitor to their domain. The very water seemed alive with currents of light and darkness that followed patterns inaccessible to mortal understanding. But it is when Erythea appears on the horizon that Heracles truly grasps the scale of what he has encountered. The island is not merely a patch of land. It is an entire world with its own weather, its own laws of nature, and its unique relationship with the divine forces shaping reality. Geryon's cattle graze on grass that glows with an inner light, drink from streams that flow uphill, and move with a grace that speaks of creatures marked by power beyond the mortal realm. The confrontation with Orthus happens first, as Heracles expected. The two-headed dog emerges from the mystical landscape like a living shadow, each head growling with fury at this intrusion into its master's domain. But Heracles has learned a lesson from his battle with the Hydra, and he knows that multi-headed creatures require different tactics than ordinary foes. Instead of trying to fight both heads at once, Heracles uses his speed and intelligence to focus their attention on each other. By positioning himself so that each head must attack across the other's field of vision, he turns Orthus's advantage into its weakness. The dog becomes confused, unsure which head should lead the attack. And in that moment of hesitation, Heracles strikes with his club. Orthus's defeat forces Eurytion to flee, and here Heracles faces a different kind of trial. The herdsman is not a monster to be vanquished or a creature to be tamed. He is a man doing his job, protecting property rightfully belonging to his master. The ensuing fight is a battle between two skilled warriors, each committed to his sense of duty. But Heracles has learned an important lesson from his encounter with the Amazons. Sometimes the most noble approach proves to be the most practical. Instead of trying to kill Eurytion, he focused on disarming the herdsman and creating enough space to accomplish his mission without unnecessary bloodshed. The confrontation with Geryon himself proved to be the strangest battle in Heracles' career. Fighting an enemy with three bodies required constant adaptation, as each aspect of the monster brought different strengths and strategies to the fight. One body might be skilled with weapons, another might rely on brute force, and a third might use cunning and deception. But Heracles had learned to observe his enemies carefully, and he noticed something crucial about Geryon's nature. The three bodies did not always perfectly coordinate. Sometimes they acted at cross purposes, each trying to execute its own strategy without consulting the others. This lack of perfect unity becomes the key to victory. By forcing Geryon to fight in a confined space where the three bodies hinder each other's movements, Heracles turns the monster's greatest strength into a weakness. The battle ends not with a dramatic final blow, but with Geryon collapsing from exhaustion and lack of coordination, his three aspects too tired and confused to effectively continue fighting. The gathering of the cattle and the subsequent journey back to mainland Greece present a grand narrative in themselves, worthy of an epic. These creatures are not ordinary animals, they possess divine origins, and thus require exceptional care and attention. The return journey, driving the mysterious herd across an entire continent, fraught with the need to evade bandit gangs and monstrous creatures inevitably attracted by such valuable beings, tests every skill Heracles has developed. But it is during this long journey home that Heracles experiences a revelation that will influence all his remaining labours. Geryon's cattle, despite their mystical nature, are inherently peaceful creatures. They do not seek confrontation or harm. They simply wish to graze peacefully and live according to their natural disposition. The cruelty that accompanies their existence stems not from their own temperament, but from the strife born of the desire to possess such precious property. When Heracles finally presents the herd to Eurystheus, the ruler's response is immediate and quite telling. Instead of claiming these animals for himself, he orders them to be sacrificed to Hera, transforming what should rightfully have been a triumph of successful completion into a ritual of divine appeasement. The cattle, which had obediently followed Heracles across continents and oceans, are consigned to destruction to placate the very goddess who instigated all his torments. Standing in the royal courtyard and watching the smoke rise from the sacrificial pyres, Heracles confronts a bitter truth he had previously avoided. His deeds are not, in fact, about completing tasks or proving his own worth. They are about sating Hera's insatiable appetite for vengeance. And no triumph, no accumulated wisdom will ever truly satisfy her thirst for his humiliation. Such an insight might have crushed a former, less resilient Heracles, but the hero who had journeyed to the ends of the earth and back had learned something momentous about the profound essence of service and self-sacrifice. Sometimes the most significant victories remain unseen by those who judge them, and sometimes the true greatness of heroism lies in the ability to continue serving, even if those for whom he dedicates his efforts are unworthy of his sacrifice. As he prepares for his 11th labour, Heracles carries with him not only the accumulated experience of his latest success, but also a deeper understanding of the true purpose of his struggle. It is not about Eurystheus's approval or even Hera's forgiveness. It is only about the inner conviction that he is transforming into a being worthy of the atonement he seeks, regardless of whether anyone else recognizes this inner transformation.